Section 1. The surface what everyone already knows. There is something almost hypnotic about returning to a world you have known for years. You close your eyes, and it is already there waiting, a yellow house on a quiet street in a fictional Rhode Island town. The sound of a TV always on somewhere in the background. The smell of something burning in a kitchen, no one is really watching. The world of Family Guy is one of the most recognizable pieces of animated fiction ever put to screen, and yet most people who feel completely comfortable with it, who can quote the cutaways, who know the theme song by heart, who grew up falling asleep to reruns on a cable channel at 2 in the morning. Most of those people only know what lives near the very top of the water. Below the surface, the iceberg goes deep, deeper than most people expect. There are layers of production history, buried story decisions, strange coincidences, near disasters, and genuine mysteries sitting underneath everything familiar and comfortable about this show. Some of it is warm and fascinating. Some of it is genuinely unsettling. All of it is real. So tonight, we are going to descend into it together, slowly, calmly, with no hurry and no rush, because the iceberg rewards patience. Before we go anywhere, though, let us spend some time at the top. Right at the surface, where the water is clear and the light still reaches. Because understanding everything below requires a firm foundation in everything above, and the surface of the Family Guy iceberg is honestly more interesting than most people give it credit for. The show premiered on the 31st of January, 1999. Not a random Tuesday, not a quiet autumn evening. It debuted immediately following Super Bowl 33, which was one of the most valuable television time slots that existed in the American broadcast landscape. Fox had bet big on this strange animated show about a bumbling Rhode Island family, and they positioned it with as much support as the network could possibly offer. The result was extraordinary. That first episode, titled Death Has a Shadow, pulled in approximately 22 million viewers on its opening night. 22 million people watched the Griffin family for the very first time on that late January evening, and the show they watched felt genuinely unlike anything else on the air. There are reasons for that, and those reasons go much further back than most people realize. Seth MacFarlane, the creator, the voice, the engine behind the entire machine, did not arrive at Family Guy from nowhere. He built his way toward it through years of craft, experimentation, and a particular kind of ambition that never really switched off. He studied animation at the Rhode Island School of Design, which is itself one of the most respected and competitive art schools in the United States. Getting in is genuinely difficult. Thriving there is harder still. MacFarlane did both, and while he was there, he created a short animated film as his thesis project in 1995 called The Life of Larry. That 11-minute film is a strange and fascinating artifact to look at now, because the DNA of Family Guy is everywhere in it. There is a dim, well-meaning heavyset man named Larry, who lives with his wife, also named Lois, and his son, and his talking dog named Steve. Larry sounds remarkably like Peter Griffin. Steve sounds unmistakably like Brian Griffin. The cutaway structure of the humor is already present. The relationship between the lovable fool and his intelligent dog is already the heart of the thing. MacFarlane was not just making a student film. He was, without knowing it yet, writing the first chapter of something that would run for decades. His professor at RISD and accounts on exactly who very submitted the film to Hanna-Barbera, the legendary animation studio responsible for The Flintstones and Yogi Bear, and dozens of other foundational American cartoons. Hanna-Barbera saw it and hired MacFarlane immediately. He was a young man, newly out of school, suddenly working at one of the great studios of the medium. During his time there, he worked on shows like Johnny Bravo, Dexter's Laboratory, and Cow and Chicken, picking up technical knowledge and professional habits that would serve him for the rest of his career. In 1997, he made a follow-up to The Life of Larry, called Larry and Steve. This one aired as part of Cartoon Network's world premiere Toons block, a programming strand specifically designed to showcase new animation from emerging creators. The short featured the same basic dynamic as before, a slow, well-meaning older man and his sharp, sardonic talking dog going through the rhythms of ordinary life in absurd ways. Executives at Fox saw it. They wanted more. They approached MacFarlane and offered him the opportunity to develop it into a full series. Fox gave him a budget of $50,000 to produce a 15-minute pilot presentation. MacFarlane delivered it. Fox greenlit the series. The characters of Larry and Steve evolved and shifted during that development process, gaining new names, new textures, new supporting family members. The wife kept her name. The son became Chris. A daughter appeared, Meg, and a baby arrived who would eventually become one of the most original characters in the history of animated television. And MacFarlane himself became, at just 24 years old, the youngest executive producer in the history of American network television up to that point. The show that emerged from all of this was set in the fictional town of Quahog, Rhode Island. Though we will not be using that name throughout the rest of this script, since the show itself has largely retired it in recent seasons. The Griffins lived at 31 Spooner Street, in a yellow house with a blue door that became one of the most instantly recognizable addresses in animation. The family that populated it was built with deliberate care. Every character had a role. Every role served the story. And in those first 3 seasons, before the storms and the cancellations and the resurrections and the slow drift towards something very different, the show worked with a kind of internal logic and warmth that is surprisingly easy to miss if you only know it from later years. Peter Griffin was funny because he meant well. That is the thing that gets lost when people talk about his later evolution, and it is worth sitting with for a moment. The comedy of a foolish character is only sustainable if the audience can see the humanity underneath the foolishness. Early Peter had that in abundance. He loved his family clumsily and completely. He made terrible decisions but felt the weight of them. He got it wrong and tried to get it right. He was not performing stupidity. He was living it, genuinely and warmly. Lois was the reasonable one, but she was never simply a straight woman. She had her own wants and frustrations, her own history as a wealthy heiress who chose an ordinary life, her own sense of humor. Brian was the intellectual voice of the household, but he was also a failed writer who drank a little too much and fell for the wrong people. Meg was the ignored teenager in a family too loud and too strange for her to ever find her footing. Chris was the sweet, directionless son who wanted to please everyone and rarely managed it. And Stewie, the British-accented, world-domination-obsessed infant in the yellow onesie, was something genuinely new. A baby who thought and spoke like a Bond villain while the adults around him heard only babbling. The gap between what the audience was hearing and what the other characters were hearing was the engine of some of the funniest material the show ever produced. That is the surface. That is what almost everyone knows. But the iceberg starts just below the waterline, and you might already be surprised by some of what is waiting there. Drop a comment below and let us know where you are watching from and what time it is. There is something special about this particular kind of content being consumed at strange hours in different corners of the world. And if you are enjoying what you are hearing, a subscription costs you nothing and helps more than you might imagine. Section 2. The canceled show that refused to die. Most television shows, when they are canceled, stay canceled. The television graveyard is full of beloved series that were cut short and never came back, and the conventional wisdom of the industry has always been that cancellation is the end of the story. What happened to Family Guy between 2002 and 2005 is one of the most extraordinary reversals in the history of American broadcasting, and the full story of how it happened is genuinely stranger and more complicated than the simple version most people know. The trouble started early, and it came from the outside, not from any failing of the show itself. During its second season, Fox moved Family Guy to Thursday nights at 9 in the evening. That placed it directly opposite Frasier on NBC, which was at that point one of the most critically beloved and widely watched comedies on television. Frasier was sophisticated, warm, and possessed of a devoted audience that had been building for nearly a decade. Family Guy was young, anarchic, and building its following week by week. The scheduling was, to be blunt, a form of institutional sabotage, whether Fox intended it that way or not. The ratings dropped. Fox moved the show again, this time to Tuesday nights, where it found itself competing with Who Wants to Be a Millionaire on ABC, a program that was at the height of its cultural moment, pulling in enormous numbers as America discovered its fascination with quiz television. Family Guy was shuffled around the schedule repeatedly, never given a stable home long enough for a proper audience to form around it, and by the end of the third season in 2002, Fox canceled it. The show was gone. For about a year, it looked permanent. The writing staff scattered. People found other jobs. MacFarlane moved forward with other projects. The assumption in the industry was that Family Guy had been a decent show that had simply been unable to find its footing in a competitive landscape, and that was the end of it. What happened next began with a business decision that seemed almost comically undervalued at the time. Cartoon Network acquired the rights to air Family Guy reruns on their Adult Swim late-night block. They got those rights cheaply, very cheaply, because nobody thought the show was worth much anymore. The asking price was low because the expected return was low. Adult Swim was a growing presence in late-night cable, but it was not yet the cultural institution it would become. And picking up the reruns of a canceled Fox cartoon felt like the kind of modest, economical programming move that a network makes when it is trying to fill airtime without spending a lot of money. The reruns premiered on Adult Swim on the 20th of April 2003. The response was not modest. Almost immediately, Family Guy became the highest-rated program on the entire Adult Swim block. It was not just competitive, it was dominant. Late-night audiences, a demographic that skewed younger and was watching television at the kinds of hours when the traditional network model did not apply in the same way, responded to Family Guy with a kind of enthusiasm that felt almost anomalous. The show's viewership on Adult Swim boosted the block's overall numbers by 239%. That is not a modest success. That is a signal that something real was happening. At the same time, something was occurring in the physical retail space that was even more telling. The DVD sets for the first and second seasons of Family Guy came out, and they sold. Not politely, not modestly, they sold with the kind of numbers that made studios take notice. Over 400,000 copies moved in relatively short order. People were not just watching the reruns on cable at midnight. They were buying the show, putting it on their shelves, showing it to friends, introducing it to people who had never seen it during its original run. A community was forming, and it was forming fast. Fox's attention was caught. The network that had canceled Family Guy twice, yes, twice, because there had been an earlier, shorter cancellation during the original run, before the show properly established itself, was now watching its former property generate significant cultural and commercial momentum on another network's platform. The calculus changed. By 2004, Fox made the decision to order new episodes and bring the show back for a fourth season, which would air in 2005. Fans celebrated with genuine, almost disbelieving joy. This was a thing that did not happen in television. Shows did not come back from cancellation. Not really. Not with the kind of full-scale network commitment that was being offered here. But the audience had proven something had made an undeniable argument with their viewing habits and their purchasing behavior, and the network had been forced to listen. There is a shadow side to all of this, though, one that the celebration tended to obscure. The 3-year gap between the cancellation and the revival was not neutral time. It changed things in ways that would only become fully apparent in the seasons that followed. MacFarlane has spoken about one of the consequences directly, because the show had been canceled and then brought back, and because that cycle had disrupted any sense of stable employment for the writers who worked on it. They were always having to rebuild the writing room. People who had shaped the voice and tone of those first 3 seasons had moved on to other things. New writers came in during the revival, bringing different sensibilities, different instincts, different ideas about what made the show funny and what the characters were supposed to be. The animation also changed. The early seasons had been handled by Rough Draft Studios, which gave the show a particular energy, a loose, slightly rough quality that matched the anarchic spirit of the humor. The revival brought in different studios, different approaches, cleaner lines and smoother movement, but also something stiffer, something that felt more manufactured. These are subtle shifts, but in animation, subtlety matters. The way a face moves determines whether a joke lands. The way a body falls affects whether you laugh. The visual language of the early seasons was part of what made them work, and the revival was operating with a slightly different visual language. None of this made the revival bad. Seasons 4 and 5, while clearly different from what came before, still had the capacity for genuine brilliance. But the seeds of everything that would follow the Flanderization, the shifting of tones, the gradual erosion of the warmth that held the early show together, were planted during this period, in the space between cancellation and return. The full story of how Family Guy came back from the dead is one of the most interesting stories in the history of American television. But it is also, if you look at it closely enough, the story of how a show stopped being fully itself. The resurrection was real. The consequences were real too. There is something else about the pre-revival period that almost no one who watches the show casually is aware of. During the time the show was off the air, MacFarlane was approached about various projects and kept himself busy in ways that would quietly shape the future of the Family Guy universe. He was developing what would become American Dad, a show that launched in 2005 and went on to follow a trajectory so different from Family Guy's that the comparison between the two became one of the most revealing stories in all of modern animation. But we will get to that. What matters at this stage of the iceberg is the atmosphere of that gap. A beloved show canceled, a writing team scattered, a creator moving forward while looking back, an audience finding the show through alternative channels and refusing to let it disappear, and eventually, triumphantly, inevitably, a return. But not quite the same return. Never quite the same. The water gets a little darker from here. The things that live a bit further down require a longer look, and some of them are more surprising than you might expect from a cartoon about a cartoon family in a cartoon town. Section 3. The characters you thought you knew. Underneath the most recognizable animated family in American television history, there are stories and decisions and histories that fundamentally change how you understand them. Every major character on Family Guy has a backstory more layered than the show usually lets on, and some of the details about where these people came from and where they were originally supposed to go are genuinely startling. Start with Peter, the voice that defines him, that thick, slightly labored New England drawl with its rounded vowels and its tendency toward breathless enthusiasm, did not come from any character McFarlane had played before. It came from real life. Specifically, it came from a security guard named Paul Timmons, who worked at the Rhode Island School of Design while McFarlane was a student there. Timmons was a large man, a native Rhode Islander, and he had what McFarlane would later describe as an absolutely singular way of speaking, a la-di-da quality to his accent, a tendency to ramble in a half-confused, half-cheerful way without any apparent internal filter. McFarlane loved listening to him. He absorbed the voice, he studied the rhythms, and he eventually transplanted them into the character he was building. Timmons was later interviewed by ABC after the 2013 Oscars, when McFarlane was hosting the ceremony and the world was paying attention to his biography. The interview confirmed the connection. Timmons knew he had been the inspiration. He was remarkably good-natured about the whole thing. What is fascinating about this is that Timmons was not performing anything. He was not consciously funny. He was just a man doing his job with a particular voice and a particular way of engaging with the world around him. McFarlane saw something in that naturalness, something that he described as an absence of self-editing that he felt was the key to the character. "I knew 1,000 Peter Griffins growing up in New England," he said in one interview. Guys who would not think before they spoke. There was no self-editing mechanism. Peter's comedy, at its best, comes from exactly that quality. The joke is not that he is stupid. The joke is that he never stops to consider how what he is about to say will land before he says it. Brian's voice, by contrast, is something much closer to McFarlane's natural speaking voice. This is a deliberate choice that carries a certain amount of biographical resonance. When McFarlane voices Brian, the aspirational, literate, occasionally insufferable dog, he does not put on a voice the way he does for Peter or Stewie or Quagmire. He speaks more or less as himself. The intellectual yearnings, the literary pretensions, the capacity for genuine warmth alongside an occasionally brutal selfishness, there is a version of the reading of Brian Griffin that is more autobiographical than any other character on the show. Stewie's voice is a different kind of homage. The accent and delivery are modeled specifically on the English actor Rex Harrison, in particular his performance in the 1964 musical film My Fair Lady, where Harrison played the demanding, patrician professor Henry Higgins. If you go back and listen to Higgins speaking in that film, the particular arch quality, the disdain, the sense of being surrounded by people who cannot possibly meet your standards, you hear Stewie Griffin. McFarlane took that voice and dropped it into the body of a 1-year-old with elaborate plans for world domination. The contrast is what makes it funny. The specificity of the reference is what makes it interesting. Lois's voice, meanwhile, comes from a completely different place. Alex Borstein, who has voiced Lois since the very beginning, based the character's vocal quality on a relative of hers, a cousin, or in some accounts an older family member, who had a particular manner of speaking that Borstein found both warm and quietly absurd. The performance she built from that source material became one of the most sustained vocal performances in American animation, a slightly strained, perpetually reasonable voice trying to hold everything together while everything determinedly refused to be held. Seth Green's approach to Chris Griffin drew on a completely different source. Green has described his audition for the role in some detail over the years, and the detail he mentions most often is that he did an impression of Buffalo Bill, the villain from The Silence of the Lambs, in the room. Jonathan Demme's 1,000 991 thriller features Ted Levine as a deeply unsettling character who speaks in a particular breathy, slightly dissociated way, and Green somehow identified a kernel of that quality as useful for a directionless teenage boy. McFarlane responded to it. Green got the part. When you listen to Chris Griffin with that knowledge, something odd happens. You can occasionally hear it, buried underneath the sweetness, the faintest ghost of something darker and stranger than a cartoon boy should have. Meg is perhaps the most complicated character when it comes to origins, because her origins involve a transition that fundamentally changed the role. In the pilot and throughout most of the first season, Meg was voiced by Lacey Chabert, then a teenager best known for her role on the drama Party of Five. Chabert played the role with a certain earnest quality, a genuine attempt to find the character's interiority. But she had scheduling conflicts with her other work, and she left the role before the second season began. Mila Kunis took over from season 2 onward, and has voiced Meg ever since. What is fascinating about this transition is the audition story. When Kunis came in to read for the part, McFarlane gave her specific and somewhat unusual notes. He told her she was speaking too quickly. He asked her to come back and enunciate more carefully. When she said she had it under control, he hired her. The quality he was looking for in Meg was something restrained, something slightly flattened, a voice that conveyed a character always trying a little too hard and never quite getting the response she wanted. Kunis found that quality and has sustained it across more than 20 seasons. There is a real person who inspired Quagmire, though the details here are less precisely documented than the Peter Griffin-Paul Timmons connection. What is well established is that the character's physical design, the enormous, prominent chin, the slightly leering quality of the face was meant to evoke a very specific type of person that McFarlane and the early writing staff had in mind when they built him. Quagmire was intended as a satire of a certain kind of mid-century American masculinity, the lounge lizard, the neighbor who is simultaneously friendly and deeply unsettling, who talks about women as though they are a separate category of experience rather than people. The show's relationship with Quagmire over the years has been complicated. There are moments when the satire is clear and sharp, and moments when the satire dissolves into the thing itself, but the original conception of him had a clear, critical edge. Then there is the matter of characters who almost existed but did not, and characters who existed briefly and then vanished. The most notable of these is a recurring character named Vinny, an Italian-American dog voiced by Tony Sirico, one of the actors from The Sopranos, who was introduced to replace Brian Griffin after Brian was killed by a car in season 12. Vinny was in the show for exactly 2 episodes before Stewie used time travel to go back and save Brian, at which point Vinny ceased to exist. The character was genuinely liked by some fans during his brief tenure. There is an oddly melancholy quality to his existence in the canon, a character who was vivid and specific and voiced by someone wonderful, who nonetheless had a lifespan measured in episodes. There is also the matter of the giant chicken, whose role in the show is more complicated than it first appears. The character, an anthropomorphic chicken named Ernie who appears periodically to engage in elaborate, multi-scene brawls with Peter for reasons never fully explained, began as a single gag in season 2. Peter gets a coupon from a chicken. The coupon is expired. A fight breaks out. The fight escalates to a degree that is clearly meant to be absurd, going on far longer and becoming far more violent than any sane version of such a dispute would. The gag worked. Audiences loved it. The chicken came back, and kept coming back, and eventually acquired a name, and a wife, and a backstory, and a position in the canon as one of the show's most distinctive recurring elements. What the chicken actually represents depends on which reading of the show you find most convincing. The most popular fan theory is that the chicken is a manifestation of Peter's pent-up rage, an external target for all the suppressed frustration and aggression that he cannot express toward his family or his boss or the world at large. The brawls are always triggered by some petty slight, something absurd and low stakes, which then escalates into genuine destruction and injury. If you read Peter as a man who contains enormous amounts of feeling that he has no language for, the chicken fights are his emotional pressure valve. When he beats Ernie to what appears to be the point of death and then walks away to continue his day, something has been released, something has been processed, something has, for the moment, been resolved. Whether or not that reading is correct, the chicken has become one of the most recognizable elements of the show's visual language, and it started from a single throwaway gag about an expired coupon. That is the nature of this show's relationship With its own material, things that were meant to be small become enormous, and things that were designed to be enormous sometimes shrink to almost nothing. Section 4. The episodes that were never supposed to exist. Every long-running television show has a graveyard of episodes that were pulled, shelved, banned, or altered beyond recognition before they ever reached an audience. Family Guy, with its particular appetite for controversial material and its long, complicated relationship with the network that has always been somewhat uncomfortable with the show it profits from, has a more substantial graveyard than most. The first major casualty was an episode called When You Wish Upon a Weinstein. This was a third-season episode, originally written and produced in the year 2000, that centered on Peter Griffin's genuinely misguided belief that Jewish people are inherently better with money than everyone else. The plot has Peter seeking out the help of a Jewish accountant named Max Weinstein, voiced by the distinctly deadpan Ben Stein, and then, in a particularly catastrophic logical leap, deciding that the solution to Chris's uncertain future is to have him convert to Judaism. The episode includes an original song performed in the style of a Broadway number, written as a direct parody of the classic Disney Pinocchio tune. Fox executives looked at the episode and decided they could not air it. The concern was that even though the intent of the material was clearly satirical, using Peter's idiocy to expose and mock the anti-Semitic stereotype it was built around, the execution was ambiguous enough that some audiences might miss the satire entirely and take the premise at face value. The episode was shelved, not destroyed, not completely buried, but held back from broadcast. It eventually made it to air in 2003, during Family Guy's Adult Swim run. By that point, the show's audience had self-selected to some degree toward viewers who were already primed to receive its humor as satire. The episode aired without significant incident. Fox broadcast it themselves in 2004. Looking back at it now, the controversy seems both understandable and somewhat overblown. The show's satirical intent is evident to anyone watching with reasonable attention, but the nature of satire is that it requires the audience to do some of the work, and not every audience is always willing. The far more significant casualty came later, with an episode called Partial Terms of Endearment. This was the 21st episode of the 8th season, produced in 2010 and built around the premise of Lois agreeing to be a surrogate mother for an old college friend. The friend and her husband die in a car accident during the pregnancy, leaving Lois to make the decision about what to do with the child she is carrying. The episode handles the abortion debate with what critics who did see it generally described as a surprising degree of even-handedness. Peter is manipulated by pro-life advocates and ends up on the wrong side of the argument in the way that Peter always ends up on the wrong side of the argument. And the show's overall stance is sympathetic to bodily autonomy, but not in a preachy or one-sided way. Fox refused to air it. The network's president at the time, Kevin Riley, cited the fragility of the subject matter as the reason, abortion being a topic so divisive in American culture that even a satirical engagement with it was deemed too risky for broadcast. Adult Swim also declined to run it, which meant it had no cable outlet either. The only way American audiences could see Partial Terms of Endearment was on the Season 8 DVD, where it was included as a bonus. The BBC aired it in the United Kingdom on the 20th of June 2010, where it reached just under 1 million households and received positive reviews. The irony of an American show that was too controversial for American television being broadcast without incident in Britain is one of those moments that says something interesting about the different cultural tolerances on either side of the Atlantic. What makes this episode particularly noteworthy in the context of the Iceberg is that it was announced publicly at San Diego Comic-Con in 2009, before Season 8 had even aired, that the episode would not be shown in the United States. The Family Guy team made the announcement themselves. MacFarlane and the writing staff were clearly not hiding from the controversy. They were comfortable with the episode they had made. It was the network that blinked. The third major pulled episode is perhaps the most contextually complicated, and it is an example of something that the show itself did not do wrong. Turban Cowboy aired in March of 2013, early in the 11th season, and featured a storyline in which Peter befriends a group of Muslim men who turn out to be planning a terrorist attack on a bridge. The episode also, in one of the show's signature cutaway gags, depicted Peter winning the Boston Marathon by mowing down other runners in his car. On the 15th of April, 2013, Two homemade pressure cooker bombs detonated near the finish line of the real Boston Marathon, killing 3 people and injuring hundreds more. It was one of the most devastating terrorist attacks on American soil in the years since the 11th of September, 2001. The bombing occurred roughly a month after Turban Cowboy had aired. In the aftermath, someone online edited together footage from the episode. They spliced the cutaway of Peter running down marathoners with an unrelated scene in which Peter's phone call triggers an explosion, and posted the combined clip as though it were a single continuous scene from the episode. The edited clip spread rapidly, and was interpreted by some people as the show having somehow predicted or referenced the bombing. Seth MacFarlane moved quickly to condemn the edited clip as abhorrent, clearly distinguishing between the actual episode and the manipulated footage. Fox pulled Turban Cowboy from its website and from Hulu, and the network announced that it had no immediate plans to air it again. It is important to be clear about what happened and what did not. The episode did not predict the bombing. The scenes that people were pointing to as evidence of a sinister coincidence were not actually connected in the episode itself. They had been edited together by someone online to create a false impression. MacFarlane's response was swift, direct, and unambiguous in condemning both the real attack and the irresponsible manipulation of the show's footage. The episode was a casualty of terrible timing and opportunistic editing, not of any actual connection to a real-world atrocity. But the incident illustrates something broader about Family Guy's relationship with real-world events and the particular risks that come with a show built on dark, topical humor. The joke about the Boston Marathon had been in the episode for months before the bombing. It was a throwaway gag, barely related to the main plot, and it was aimed at a well-established comedic tradition of exaggerating sporting competition to absurd degrees. None of that context survived contact with the tragedy that followed, and the episode paid the price. There are smaller-scale examples throughout the show's history, individual jokes pulled from reruns, scenes quietly edited in subsequent broadcasts, episodes reordered or in some cases simply not repeated. The show has always lived close to the edge of what broadcast television tolerates, and it has not always managed to stay on the comfortable side of that line. Sometimes the missteps are the show's own fault. Sometimes they are the result of circumstances no one could have predicted. The Iceberg is full of both kinds. Section 5. The dark side of the writer's room. Television writing rooms are strange, pressurized, intimate environments. People who work in them spend enormous amounts of time together, often under conditions of stress and deadline, generating material that has to be not just funny, but consistently funny across dozens of episodes and years of production. The creative relationships forged in those rooms can be profound. So can the fractures. The Family Guy writing room over the show's history has been the site of several significant tensions and disruptions, most of which never fully surface in the show itself, but which shaped its direction in ways that are deeply visible if you know what you are looking for. The most obvious and significant disruption was not a conflict between people, but an event from the wider world. The Writers Guild of America strike of 2007 and 2008. This was a work stoppage that began in November of 2007 and lasted until February of 2008, roughly 100 days, during which thousands of television and film writers refused to work in protest of unfair compensation arrangements, particularly around residuals from DVD sales and the emerging digital distribution landscape. The strike devastated television production across the board. Shows running at the time suddenly ran out of new scripts. Production halted. Seasons were truncated. The creative rhythm of dozens of shows was broken in ways that took time to repair. Family Guy was among those hit hard, but the situation had a particular wrinkle. MacFarlane was a strong supporter of the writers. He walked the picket lines. He was vocal about his support for the Guild's position, and he made it clear that he stood with the people who wrote the shows that bore his name. Fox, however, made the decision during the strike to air several Family Guy episodes that had already been completed before the work stoppage began. They had the legal right to do so, since the episodes were already produced. But airing them without MacFarlane's blessing while he was publicly standing with the striking writers was an act of institutional defiance that he never fully forgot. It was an early and clear signal of the tension between MacFarlane and the network that would only grow more visible in the years that followed. The strike ended in February of 2008, and the show resumed production with the episode Back to the Woods. But the disruption had done something to the writing room's momentum. Writers who work on tight schedules build up a particular rhythm, a shared understanding of the characters, a sense of what has been established and where things are heading. When that rhythm is broken for 3 months, it does not simply snap back into place. There is a period of recalibration, and sometimes the show that comes back on the other side of that recalibration is subtly but meaningfully different from the show that went into it. Beyond the strike, there is the question of the writing staff's composition over time. MacFarlane assembled an original team for the first 3 seasons that was genuinely distinctive. The names from that early room, Chris Sheridan, Danny Smith, Gary Janetti, Ricky Blitt, Neil Goldman, Garrett Donovan, Matt Weitzman, and Mike Barker collectively developed a specific approach to the material that gave those seasons their particular voice. Several of these writers had deep connections to MacFarlane's specific sensibility. Several of them moved on during the show's first cancellation. When the show returned, the room was rebuilt, and rebuilding a writer's room is never simply a matter of filling chairs. The sensibility shifts, the priorities shift, what the room finds funny shifts. There is also the matter of MacFarlane's own engagement with the room over time. In the early years, he was present and active. He had opinions about every joke, every story, every character decision. As his career expanded, as Ted became a massive box office success, as The Orville took up increasing amounts of his creative energy, as American Dad became its own self-sustaining operation, his day-to-day involvement in Family Guy diminished. The show-running responsibilities passed to Rich Appel and Alex Sulkin, both of whom were experienced professionals with deep knowledge of the show's world. But there is a difference between knowing a world and having built it, and the room that operated without MacFarlane's close oversight made choices that MacFarlane's room might not have. One of the most persistent criticisms of the later writing seasons is that the room became less interested in consequences, that episodes would introduce dramatic changes or emotional turning points and then simply reset everything to the status quo by the following week. Characters would have profound realizations and then forget them. Relationships would shift and then snap back. The show developed what fans described as an allergy to genuine change, and that allergy made it harder and harder to invest in any single storyline because the audience learned that nothing would be permitted to stick. This is not an accident of narrative incompetence. It is a structural choice, and it reflects something specific about how the room was thinking about the show. A long-running, episodic animated comedy is, at some level, a machine for generating content, a machine that requires a stable set of conditions to operate efficiently. Change disrupts the machine. Growth disrupts the machine. If Meg actually escapes her family's cruelty, you can no longer tell the same kinds of stories about Meg. If Peter genuinely learns to be a better father, you can no longer use his cruelty as a source of comedy. The status quo, however uncomfortable or even troubling, is the precondition for the show's continued operation. The room chose the machine over the characters. Most long-running shows make that choice eventually. Family Guy made it earlier and more completely than most. There are brighter stories in the writing room's history too. Gary Janetti, one of the original writers who had been with the show from nearly the beginning, wrote one of the most praised single episodes in the show's entire run, the season 16 episode Send in Stewie, Please, which aired without commercial interruption and consisted entirely of a therapy session between Stewie and a counselor voiced by Sir Ian McKellen. Janetti crafted that episode with extraordinary care, and the result was unlike anything else the show had produced: intimate, character-driven, funny in a slower and more sustained way than the show's usual rhythm. We will go deeper into what that episode revealed in a later section. For now, it is worth noting that the writing room, even in its later years, had the capacity for work like that when the conditions were right. The tension between the machine and the moment between what the show needed to be in order to continue and what its best writers were capable of when given the freedom to try is one of the defining contradictions of Family Guy's long history. It runs through the entire Iceberg. Section 6. Stewie's Secret Identity Crisis. There is a character who lives at the intersection of the show's greatest achievement and one of its most consequential decisions, and that character is Stewie Griffin. The story of what happened to Stewie over the course of the show's run is longer and more complicated and more philosophically interesting than it might appear from the outside, and it begins with what he was originally supposed to be and ends with what he is now, which are, in almost every meaningful way, two entirely different things. When Stewie appeared in the pilot episode in January of 1999, he was presented as a fully formed character. A 1-year-old baby with the voice and vocabulary of a Bond villain, the emotional affect of a military commander, and a singular obsession with the twin goals of killing his mother and achieving world domination. The comedy was built on contrast, the visual absurdity of an infant in a high chair, surrounded by the paraphernalia of babyhood, delivering speeches about enslaving humanity with the gravity of someone who had thought very carefully about the logistics of enslaving humanity. The weapons Stewie built were specific: a ray gun, a mind control device, a time machine which appeared and disappeared and reappeared throughout the early seasons with a casual frequency that suggested Stewie had built several of them as a precaution. He spoke of his schemes with the brisk efficiency of someone who had been planning them for years, which was funny because he was 1 year old and had therefore not been doing anything for years. The gap between the scale of his ambitions and the physical reality of his situation, diapered, bottle-fed, entirely dependent on the people he was planning to destroy, was the engine of his comedy, and it was an engine that ran with extraordinary reliability in those first 3 seasons. There was also the matter of the audience. Most of the adults in Stewie's life could not understand him. They heard babbling when he spoke. They saw a baby doing baby things when he was in fact plotting the collapse of civilization. Only Brian could hear and comprehend Stewie's actual words and engage with him as an intelligent person. This created a unique and sustained dramatic irony. The audience knew something the characters did not, and that knowledge made every interaction between Stewie and Lois both funny and subtly tense. She would pick him up, coo at him, respond to his apparent sweetness, while he was in the middle of a detailed monologue about the most efficient method of eliminating her. His accent was, as we will get to shortly, a fiction within a fiction, something the show would not address directly for nearly 2 decades. But in the early seasons, it was simply part of who he was. The refined British diction that felt completely wrong for a Rhode Island baby, but completely right for a character modeled on Regency-era villainy. Starting in Season 2, small cracks began to appear in the armor. The show started introducing tiny hints of a different side to Stewie, moments where he expressed something other than menace, glimpses of vulnerability or femininity, or ordinary childish feeling beneath the elaborate persona. These were brief, almost throwaway moments in the early going. A joke about whether his diaper made his behind look large, a passing moment of genuine feeling toward Brian. They were so minor in the context of the whole character that they read as seasoning rather than as the beginning of a systematic reorientation. By Season 3, though, the seasoning was becoming something more structural. The softer side was getting more screen time. The warmth between Stewie and Brian was being developed deliberately, episode by episode, into something that felt like a genuine friendship. And Stewie's attempts on Lois's life were becoming less frequent, less central, more like punctuation in a paragraph than the main event. Then came the revival in 2005, and the decision that McFarlane and the writing team made about what to do with Stewie going forward. By their own account, they felt that the evil baby concept had been exhausted, that they had found all the angles on it they were going to find, and that continuing to repeat the same basic structure of Stewie plotting to kill Lois would produce diminishing returns. They made the conscious decision to pivot, to move Stewie away from villainy and towards something more emotionally complex, more centered on identity and relationship and the inner life of an unusual child. The Season 6 2-part episode Stewie Kills Lois and Lois Kills Stewie functioned, in retrospect, as both a farewell and a completion. In the first part, Stewie actually follows through on his lifelong goal: he kills Lois, and the episode plays it with genuine dramatic weight. In the second part, Lois is revealed to be alive and returns for a reckoning. Stewie achieves world domination. There is a confrontation between them with real stakes. It is, by the standards of what animated comedy usually permitted itself, extraordinary, suspenseful, and funny, and genuinely dark in the way the early character was always threatening to be. And then the twist: it was all a simulation on Stewie's computer, a program he had been running. None of it actually happened. The world reset. In hindsight, this is one of the most important moments in the show's history, because it communicates something about the relationship between the writers and their own creation. They wanted to honor the character. They wanted to give audiences the payoff of Stewie's central obsession actually being realized. But they were not willing to let it change anything. So they staged the fulfillment and then undid it. They gave you the experience of the completion without any of the consequences. After that 2-parter, the evil genius baby gradually retired. The world domination plots became rare. The attempts on Lois's life became almost entirely absent. In their place came a character who was insecure, emotionally complex, searching for his identity, and deeply attached to his friendship with Brian. This is not nothing. The Stewie and Brian relationship produced some of the most genuinely moving moments in the show's later years. But it replaced something irreplaceable with something that, while good, was not nearly as original. There was also the long-running question of Stewie's sexuality, which the show circled for years before addressing it directly and then declining to close the loop entirely. MacFarlane had spoken publicly about the character's queerness from relatively early in the show's history, framing it at different points as a deliberate choice, an organic development, and something that the show was not quite ready to formalize. An episode was reportedly written in which Stewie does come out as gay. The episode reportedly involves Stewie going back in time to alter a passage in Leviticus, but the episode was abandoned because of the fundamental difficulty of writing a coming-out story for a character who is physically a 1-year-old. The jokes that are available in that territory tend toward the uncomfortable. The question was finally, partially addressed in the season 16 episode Send In Stewie Please, which is among the most carefully constructed episodes the show ever produced. The setup is that Stewie has pushed another child down a flight of stairs, and the school has required him to see a therapist. The therapist, Dr. Cornelius Pritchfield, is played with great warmth and precision by Sir Ian McKellen. The episode aired without commercial interruption, the first time in the show's 16-season history that it had done that, and consists almost entirely of the conversation between Stewie and Pritchfield. What emerges from that conversation is not a neat declaration of sexuality. Stewie describes himself as fluid, and he does so with the particular combination of bravado and self-consciousness that characterizes the character at its most interesting. He identifies what he is feeling toward a classmate named Tyler, who he pushed down the stairs because he liked him and was afraid he would not be liked back. He is at pains to point out that this is not a coming-out session, and in doing so he is, as writer Gary Janetti noted in subsequent interviews, almost directly addressing the audience's expectations. The episode also reveals, in one of the show's more genuinely surprising moments, that Stewie's British accent is entirely fabricated. He does not sound the way he sounds because of anything inherent to his character. He sounds that way because he chose to sound that way because someone who did not feel like he fit in created an artificial personality for himself. His real voice, which MacFarlane performs with great commitment, sounds somewhat like Peter. The therapist, himself British, cannot hear the difference between the real voice and the performed voice, which is its own particular joke about the limits of the performance we put on for those we want to impress. Dr. Pritchfield does not survive the episode. Stewie eliminates him after their session to prevent the secrets from getting out. The show presents this as both funny and, if you think about it for too long, quite dark. The character who was supposed to grow and develop and become more emotionally open has, in the end, simply replaced his murderous relationship with his mother with a murderous relationship with anyone who gets too close to the truth of who he is. The Stewie spin-off, announced for the 2027 to 2028 television season, will take a version of the character back to something resembling his roots, using his devices to take classmates on adventures through time and space. It is an interesting choice, because it acknowledges, at least implicitly, that there is still life in the concept of Stewie as someone who acts on the world in extraordinary ways. Whether it will recapture anything of what made the original character so singular remains to be seen. The iceberg will keep growing. Section 7. The real people hidden inside the show. One of the stranger pleasures of going deep into a show's history is discovering the points where real life crossed over into the fiction, the actual people and events that got absorbed into the work, sometimes deliberately and sometimes almost accidentally. Family Guy has more of these crossings than most shows, and some of them have consequences that extended well beyond the screen. The most obvious category of real people in the show is the celebrity guest voices, of which there have been hundreds over the show's history. The show has always prided itself on its ability to attract famous names, and the range is genuinely extraordinary. From genuine legends of American entertainment to political figures to athletes to musicians who had very little in common with the world of animated comedy, except that the show somehow convinced them to show up for a recording session. Adam West is perhaps the most beloved of these appearances, and his relationship with the show was one of the longest and most affectionate collaborations in the show's history. West played the mayor of the town, a character simply called Mayor Adam West, with no pretense of fictional separation, and he played the role with an absolutely committed, straight-faced absurdism that became one of the show's most reliable pleasures. West died in 2017, and the show addressed his death in an episode that was handled with genuine care and genuine grief. The episode aired in 2018 and depicted the mayor's death and the community's mourning of him. MacFarlane and the writing staff were open about how much West had meant to the show and how strange it was to produce Family Guy without the possibility of one more scene with him in it. The character of Mayor Adam West represented something slightly unusual in the show's relationship with celebrity. A famous person who was playing a version of himself but playing it as pure fiction, with no attempt to portray anything that Adam West, the real person, actually believed or did or said. The mayor's decisions and opinions and actions were entirely invented. West was providing a voice and a quality of performance, not autobiography. Other celebrity appearances have been less uncomplicated. The show's treatment of various public figures, particularly the habit of writing them into scenes in ways that were clearly satirical but not always clearly fictional, has generated friction over the years. The show has had to navigate the fairly basic legal reality that depicting a real person in a fictional context carries with it the requirement to make the fictional nature of the depiction reasonably clear, and the show has not always been meticulous about this. There is also the matter of Carol Burnett, who in 2007 filed a lawsuit against Fox and the show's production company over an episode in which a character named Carol Burnett's Mop Lady appears a direct parody of a famous cleaning woman character that Burnett had performed on her variety show in the 1970s. Burnett claimed that the parody infringed on her rights in the original character. The lawsuit was ultimately dismissed on the grounds that the parody was protected speech, but the case raised interesting questions about where the line sits between parody, which is legally protected, and appropriation, which is more complicated. The show has also had a long and interesting relationship with itself as a subject. There are episodes that pull back the curtain on the production of Family Guy episodes, where characters acknowledge that they are on a television show, where the artificiality of the format is addressed directly, where the mechanics of the cutaway gag are examined and sometimes mocked. This self-referential quality is one of the more genuinely interesting things about the show's later years, even if it sometimes functions as a way of acknowledging problems rather than solving them. One of the most fascinating examples of real life entering the show is the story of Cleveland Brown. Cleveland was introduced in the first season as one of Peter's core friends at the bar, and he was always voiced by Mike Henry, a white actor doing a performance that was essentially a character voice rather than an impression of a real person. For more than 20 seasons, this arrangement continued. Then, in 2020, following the social conversation about the ethics of non-black actors voicing black characters in animation, a conversation that was happening across the industry and that resulted in a number of high-profile recastings on various shows, Mike Henry announced that he would be stepping down from the role of Cleveland. He did so voluntarily, expressing his own discomfort with the continuation of the arrangement in the current cultural moment. The role was taken over by Arif Zahir, a black actor and voice performer whose take on the character brought something genuinely different to the performance while retaining the essential qualities that fans recognized. The transition was handled without significant drama. MacFarlane and the production company were supportive of Henry's decision. The recasting was announced and executed, and the show continued. What is interesting about this from an Iceberg perspective is that it represents one of the clearest instances of the real world directly reshaping the show's creative personnel and, by extension, its direction. The story of Cleveland Brown is a story about a character who was always partly a real person, voiced by a real person, shaped by that person's choices and instincts, and who became a different character in some small but meaningful way when the real person changed. There are also the writers themselves, whose personal experiences and preoccupations flow into the material in ways that are not always easy to trace but are sometimes quite visible. The show's long-running engagement with questions of identity, belonging, aspiration, and failure, the themes that animate Brian Griffin's arc most powerfully, reflects something genuine about the experiences of the people who were writing it. There is a version of Brian Griffin that is deeply autobiographical, a vessel for the anxieties of young creative people who want to be taken seriously and cannot always be sure they deserve to be. The cruelty that the show sometimes directs at Brian, the way it exposes his pretensions and punishes his selfishness, has the quality of self-criticism rather than simple character assassination. The show is full of real people, in other words, Some of them are on screen, playing versions of themselves with varying degrees of accuracy and consent. Some of them are in the writing room, shaping the material with their own histories and concerns. And some of them are in the audience, finding things in the show that they recognize from their own lives, even in the context of a cartoon family in a fictional town. Section 8. The Multiverse of Family Guy. One of the things that becomes apparent when you spend enough time with Family Guy is that the show exists in a much larger fictional universe than its individual episodes usually acknowledge, and the edges of that universe are considerably stranger and more interesting than the center. The Family Guy multiverse is not a metaphor. It is a literal thing, established in canon through several episodes and extended through crossovers and spin-offs that collectively create a fabric of interconnected fictional realities. Understanding that fabric requires going back to one of the show's most celebrated and most structurally interesting episodes, Road to the Multiverse, the Season 8 premiere, which aired in 2009. In that episode, Brian and Stewie use Stewie's remote control device to travel between alternate dimensions, each of which presents a different version of the familiar world. There is a version in which Christianity never existed, and human civilization is 5,000 years more advanced. There is a version in which the Japanese won the Second World War, and the characters live in a hyper-aestheticized version of Japanese culture. There is a Disney World version, hand-drawn and impossibly cute, which parodies that particular aesthetic with some precision. And there is, memorably, a version in which dogs are the dominant species and humans live as pets. A version that features a human-faced dog version of Brian as a companion animal to a dog-faced human version of Peter. The episode is a showcase of animation versatility and comic invention, and it is one of the things that the show can still do at a high level even in its post-revival phase. But it also establishes something that fan theorists have seized upon with enthusiasm. The existence of the multiverse as a diegetic reality in the show's universe means that the differences between seasons, the character inconsistencies, the tonal shifts, the way Peter of Season 12 behaves nothing like Peter of Season 2 can be read as evidence that these are not the same characters at all, but different versions of the characters in different timelines. This theory has a certain elegant explanatory power. The post-revival Family Guy, with its crueler Peter and its more insufferable Brian and its hollower emotional register, is perhaps not the same Family Guy as the pre-cancellation version. Perhaps, during the 3-year gap, something slipped. Perhaps the family we returned to in 2005 was in some technical cosmological sense not quite the family we left in 2002. The multiverse is there. It is real. The theory is not verifiable, but it is not falsifiable either. The Cleveland Show, which ran for 4 seasons between 2009 and 2013, occupies an interesting and somewhat unstable position in the broader universe. The show was established as a spin-off from Family Guy. Cleveland Brown moving away from the town with his new family to start a new life in Stool Bend, Virginia. This was presented as a genuine departure from the main show, and for 4 seasons, Cleveland's story was told independently. But the shows cross over. Characters from Family Guy appear in The Cleveland Show. Characters from The Cleveland Show appear in Family Guy. American Dad, McFarlane's other major creation, has characters who occasionally cross over as well. There are episodes of American Dad in which characters refer to Family Guy as a television show within the American Dad universe, a meta-joke that suggests Family Guy is fiction from American Dad's perspective, which raises questions about what that means for the show's relationship to one another. The most ambitious crossover event the show ever produced was The Simpsons Guy, a Season 13 episode from 2014 in which the Griffin family encounters the Simpson family during a trip out of state. The episode runs over an hour and functions as both a genuine crossover and a sustained meditation on the differences between the two shows. There is a trial in which Peter and Homer dispute which of them invented a particular kind of joke. There is a fight between Stewie and Bart. There is a reference to the fact that Lois and Marge share a voice actress Alex Borstein's vocal range, making it possible for one person to provide both performances in the same scene. The episode was, by most accounts, handled with more care than crossover events usually receive. Both shows' writing teams collaborated, and the result felt like something both camps were comfortable with, rather than a cash grab assembled without proper attention to what made either show distinctive. There is also the direct-to-video film Stewie Griffin, The Untold Story, which was released in 2005 during the show's revival period, and which exists in a complicated canonical relationship with the main series. The film imagines a future version of Stewie who has grown up to become an ordinary, slightly sad adult man named Stu, living a life that is about as far from world domination as you can get. This future is presented as one possible destiny rather than a fixed point, and subsequent episodes have contradicted or complicated it without ever formally disavowing it. It sits in the show's canon the way certain apocryphal texts sit in religious traditions acknowledged, referenced, but not quite integrated. The multiplicity of versions and iterations and timelines that Family Guy has generated over its long history creates an interesting epistemological situation for the deeply engaged fan. Which version of the show is the authoritative one? Which Peter is the real Peter? If the multiverse contains infinite variations, and if several of those variations have been depicted in the show itself, then the question of which one is canonical becomes considerably more complicated than it would be for a show with a simpler, more linear narrative logic. This is part of what makes the Iceberg so deep. The further you go, the less stable the ground is. The show's relationship with its own continuity and with the idea of a consistent fictional universe is loose enough that almost anything can be accommodated, and that looseness creates space for a genuinely enormous amount of interpretive activity. Section 9. Death, Grief, and the Episodes that Hit Differently. There is a type of episode that every long-running animated comedy produces eventually, usually more by accident than by design, and that type is the episode that is about something real, something that sits underneath the jokes and the cutaways and the bright, flat colors, something that the audience recognizes from their own experience of being alive. Family Guy has produced several of these, and they sit in the Iceberg with a particular weight, because the show that contains them is not usually a show that trades in that kind of weight. The most famous of all Family Guy episodes is probably Brian and Stewie, which aired in Season 8 and is one of the most structurally unusual things the show ever did. The premise is simple. Brian and Stewie get locked in a bank vault over a weekend. They have to wait to be let out. There are no cutaways. There are no other characters. There are no gags in the traditional sense. There is just two characters in a small space with a lot of time and nowhere to go but toward honesty. The episode unfolds slowly and with patience, which is almost entirely unlike how Family Guy normally operates. Stewie discovers that Brian has a gun in a safety deposit box, and the discovery leads to a conversation about why. Brian admits, in language that is careful and quietly devastating, that he keeps the gun because there are moments when he thinks about ending his life. He does not explain it further than that. He does not perform distress. He simply says what is true, with the particular economy of someone who has given the thought enough time that it has moved past the acute and settled into something chronic. Stewie's response to this revelation is one of the most affecting moments in the show's entire run. He does not joke. He does not perform shock. He tells Brian, with simple directness, that he cannot allow Brian to die, that Brian matters to him, that their friendship is the most important relationship in his life, that he is not willing to live in a world without Brian in it. It is written without sentimentality and performed with restraint, and it lands with the kind of force that you only get when a show allows something to be actually true rather than gesturing in the direction of truth. The episode was criticized by some viewers who found it out of step with the show's tone, but it was celebrated by many more, and it has remained one of the most referenced and discussed episodes in the show's history because it demonstrated something that the show occasionally forgot: that when you build characters with enough specificity and enough history, they can carry real weight. Brian and Stewie worked because the audience knew them. The grief and the attachment and the fear in that vault were legible, because 20-odd years of episodes had established what these two people meant to each other, which makes the events of Season 12 even more significant. The episode Life of Brian aired in November of 2013, and in it, Brian is struck by a car outside the Griffin house and dies. The show treats it seriously. The family mourns. Stewie, who had lost his time travel remote, cannot go back and prevent it. A new dog named Vinny is introduced. The implication, carefully sustained for 2 episodes, is that this is permanent. That Family Guy has killed its second most central character. The reaction from the audience was extraordinary. The death trended on social media for days. Outlets ran headlines about it as though reporting a genuine bereavement. People who had grown up with the character expressed what was clearly real grief, not the performed kind, but the unexpected kind. The grief that arrives when something you did not realize you were attached to is suddenly absent. Then, 2 episodes later, in an episode called Christmas Guy, Stewie encounters a future version of himself in a mall, a time travel plot device, and acquires a time machine remote from this future Stewie. He uses it to go back and push Brian out of the path of the car. Brian lives. Vinny, who had been beginning to feel like a real presence, simply ceases to exist. Everything resets. The backlash was immediate and, among some fans, lasting. The prevailing reading was that Brian's death had been a rating stunt, a calculated provocation designed to generate attention and viewership without any genuine commitment to the story it was telling. The show had asked the audience to grieve and then told them, 2 weeks later, that the grief had been a test. Some fans felt manipulated, some felt insulted. The memory of the episode and what it was willing to do, kill a beloved character and then undo it for effect, became one of the most frequently cited examples of the show's bad faith with its own material. This is not an entirely fair reading. The death of Brian, and the decision to reverse it, can also be understood as a story about the limits of grief, about how loss transforms everything around the person left behind, and how the return of what was lost does not simply restore the world to what it was. Vinny is gone, but something of what Vinny represented remains. The world in which Brian died, even though it no longer exists, happened. The audience witnessed it. The emotional reality of it cannot be fully undone just because the plot was. But the episode also exists as a lesson in the dangers of the show's own structural habits. A show that cannot commit to consequences cannot fully commit to grief. When the audience knows, or has come to expect, that the status quo will always reassert itself, even the most emotionally devastating events carry a kind of hedged quality, a sense that the full weight of them is never quite going to be allowed to land. There are other episodes that sit in this part of the iceberg with their own particular heaviness. There is the Seahorse Seashell Party episode, in which the family is trapped inside during a hurricane, and Meg finally, fully, confronts them about the way they have treated her. It is a raw and uncomfortable piece of television that builds to what feels like a moment of genuine reckoning, and then retreats from it, asking Meg to take back what she said and return to being the family's designated target. The episode is discussed in detail in other sections of this script, but it belongs here too, in the category of episodes that reach for something real and then pull back at the last moment. The show's engagement with death is always ultimately about the limits of what it is willing to lose. It can mourn. It can allow its characters to feel genuine loss, but it cannot allow that loss to be permanent, because permanence would break the machine. The iceberg's deepest emotional material lives in the space between what the show was willing to feel and what it was willing to keep. Section 10. The conspiracy theories and urban legends. Every long-running cultural phenomenon accumulates legends around itself. Some of these legends are rooted in real events, misunderstood or exaggerated over time. Some are wholly invented, beginning as jokes or thought experiments, and gradually acquiring the patina of fact through repetition. Family Guy has a particularly rich mythology of this kind, because its long history, its enormous volume of content, and its willingness to engage with dark and complicated material create enormous space for the kind of pattern recognition that generates conspiracy theories. The most pervasive and the most genuinely unsettling of the show's real-world adjacencies has nothing to do with fan theories. It is the story of Seth MacFarlane and the 11th of September 2001. In the months following September 11th, as the enormous shock and grief of the attacks was being processed by everyone who had experienced them, a story emerged about the show's creator that was both simple and astonishing. MacFarlane had been scheduled to return to Los Angeles from Boston on the morning of the 11th of September 2001 on American Airlines Flight 11. Flight 11 was the first plane to be hijacked that morning. It was the first plane to hit the World Trade Center, striking the North Tower at 8:46 in the morning. Everyone aboard it died. MacFarlane was not aboard it. The reason he was not aboard it is simultaneously mundane and incredible. The previous night, he had given a lecture at his alma mater, the Rhode Island School of Design, and had gone out afterward with some of the faculty. He had a few drinks. He stayed out a little later than planned. His travel agent had made a clerical error on his itinerary, listing the flight's departure time as 10 minutes later than it actually was. MacFarlane arrived at the gate at Logan International Airport in Boston, 10 minutes after the door closed and 10 minutes after the plane pushed back from the gate. He sat down in the terminal. He fell asleep. He woke up sometime later to a commotion. He looked at the television screens. He saw the news of the first impact. He looked at the flight information. He heard the announcement of which flight it was. He turned to the person next to him and said, according to his own subsequent account, that the plane that had just hit the tower was the one he was supposed to be on. MacFarlane has discussed this experience in several interviews over the years. He is remarkable in those discussions for the absence of the drama that one might expect, the sense of fate, the experience of having been chosen or spared, the survivor's guilt that often accompanies near misses of this magnitude. He has been consistent in saying that he does not think of himself as fatalistic, that he does not feel that the coincidence had deep meaning, that he has missed planes before and coincidences happen. He describes his relationship to the experience with a kind of calm that some people have found cold and that others have found honest and psychologically healthy. The irony that is impossible not to notice is that Family Guy, the show whose continued existence depends on MacFarlane's continued existence, was itself in an extremely fragile position in September of 2001. The show had been struggling with the scheduling problems we described earlier. A second cancellation was already in the air. MacFarlane was the creator and the voice of 4 of the show's central characters. His death would almost certainly have ended the show permanently, long before the Adult Swim reruns and the DVD sales and the revival of 2005 could have happened. The entire subsequent history of Family Guy, all 20-plus seasons, the Cleveland Show spin-off, American Dad, The Orville, Ted rests on 10 minutes and a wrong time on an itinerary. On a different and considerably less grave level, the Family Guy iceberg is populated with fan theories of varying degrees of elaboration and plausibility. Some of the most discussed include the idea that the Griffin family is in purgatory, that the characters we are watching are all dead, being processed through some afterlife that forces them to live out exaggerated versions of their worst qualities in perpetuity. This theory is appealing because it accounts for the show's general absence of consequences and the way time and continuity operate so loosely in the show's universe. It is not verifiable and not meant to be. There is the theory that Brian Griffin has a human mind. The premise is that Brian is too intelligent, too culturally sophisticated, too clearly oriented toward human emotional needs to be simply a dog who happens to be able to talk. The show's universe does include examples of talking animals who are clearly animals. Regular dogs appear, behave like dogs, and are treated as animals. Brian is categorically different. The theory proposes that Brian's intelligence is explained by a human consciousness somehow transplanted into a dog's body, perhaps a CIA experiment. The theory suggests, given the show's established connection to the intelligence community through American Dad, the theory sits comfortably in the show's own loosely established lore and connects the Family Guy and American Dad universes in an intriguing way. There is the theory that the entire show is a book being written by Brian. This one has the advantage of explaining both the formal peculiarities of the show, the cutaways, the fourth wall breaks, the casual contradiction of established facts, and Brian's own emotional investment in the family stories. If Brian is the author, then the distance between Brian the character and Seth MacFarlane the creator collapses in an interesting way. Brian, who shares MacFarlane's voice in many of his apparent preoccupations, would become the show's version of its own creator, a writer who lives in the story he is telling. There is the theory, advanced in various forms across fan communities, that the reason the post-revival show feels so different from the pre-cancellation show is not poor writing or shifted priorities, but rather the literal multiverse, that the family we return to in Season 4 is a slightly different version of the family we knew in Season 3. This is the theory that reframes the show's inconsistencies, not as failures of craft but as evidence of a larger cosmological reality that the show itself established. The basement of the iceberg, where the oldest and strangest content accumulates, also includes a number of urban legends about specific episodes' content that supposedly aired but cannot be found, scenes that allegedly existed in early cuts before being removed, jokes that were reportedly written and read at table but never made it to screen. Most of these legends do not survive serious investigation. The ones that do are usually more mundane than the legend version, a crude joke that was cut for time rather than content, a celebrity cameo that did not pan out, a story idea that was written in the room and then abandoned before the script stage. The iceberg is partly made of stories that are real and partly made of stories that feel real, and one of the pleasures of going deep into it is discovering which kind you are dealing with. Section 11. The Business of Family Guy. Behind every creative decision in the history of Family Guy, there is a business decision. Sometimes the two align. Sometimes they contradict each other. And sometimes the business decision wins even when the creative case for a different choice is overwhelming. Understanding Family Guy fully requires understanding the economics that have always surrounded it, the financial logic that determined when it was canceled, why it was revived, and why it continues to be produced even as its audience has shrunk to a fraction of what it once was. The show premiered in January of 1999 with that extraordinary Super Bowl audience of 22 million viewers. That number was partly an illusion. No show premiering after the Super Bowl is going to maintain those viewership figures in its regular slot. But even accounting for the inflation of the time slot, the first season averaged 12.8 million households and ranked 33rd in the overall Nielsen ratings. For a new animated comedy, that was solid. Fox was pleased. The scheduling problems that followed the moves to Thursday against Frasier, the moves to Tuesday against Who Wants to Be a Millionaire produced real damage to the numbers, and the show's first cancellation and subsequent revival form a story we have already told. What is relevant here is the economic logic of the revival. The Adult Swim ratings and the DVD sales did not bring the show back out of sentiment. They brought it back because they constituted evidence that there was a real, quantifiable audience for the show that was willing to demonstrate its enthusiasm in measurable ways. Fox looked at those numbers and saw money. The revival was an economic decision dressed in the language of love for the material. Season 4, the first revival season, averaged around 7.9 million viewers. That was less than the first season's per-episode average, but it was enough to establish that the audience was real and that the show had a future. From there, the decline was gradual. Season after season, year after year, the numbers ticked downward, not precipitously enough in any given year to prompt emergency action, but consistently enough that when you look at the trajectory over a decade, the pattern is unmistakable. By season 13, the average viewership had dropped to 5.86 million. By season 20, it was 1.31 million, with a demographic rating among adults aged 18 to 49 of 0.45. By season 23, the most recent season for which complete data was available at the time of this script's composition, the average was 723,000 viewers. Less than 750,000 people watching new episodes of one of the most famous animated shows in American television history. That number needs to be held against the starting point. The show debuted to 22 million. Even accounting for the Super Bowl inflation, the first sustained season averaged 12.8 million. The loss over the course of the show's run represents somewhere between 80 and 90% of the original audience. Not all of that loss is meaningful. Television viewership declined broadly over this period as the medium fragmented, and a show that loses viewers at roughly the rate the medium is losing them can still be considered a relative success. But the decline in Family Guy is steeper than the general trend. The show's audience is not just moving elsewhere, it is declining faster than the average. The network responded to this trend with scheduling changes that carried symbolic weight. In 2019, the show was moved from its longtime 9 o'clock Sunday evening slot to 9:30. In 2023, it was moved from Sunday, entirely removed from the animation domination block that had been its home for nearly 2 decades, and relocated to Wednesday nights. Wednesday, a weekday. The last time Family Guy aired on a weekday was 2002, during the troubled original run that preceded the first cancellation. In the television industry, being moved from Sunday night to Wednesday night is understood as a statement about where the network believes a show sits in the hierarchy. Sunday nights are for headliners. Wednesday nights are for shows that are still valuable enough to air but no longer prestigious enough to anchor a signature programming block. The move was politely framed by Fox as a scheduling adjustment. It read as something closer to a demotion. The question that naturally follows from this trajectory is, why does the show continue? If the audience has shrunk to the degree that the numbers indicate, and if the network's own scheduling decisions suggest that it no longer considers the show a priority, what keeps it on the air? The answer is the economics of animated television, which are fundamentally different from the economics of live-action production. Animated shows are cheap. There are no expensive sets to build, no cast of on-screen actors whose salaries increase with their fame, no location shoots or elaborate physical production costs. The voice actors record in a booth. The animation is produced overseas, in studios that specialize in the work, and can do it efficiently. The whole machine is lean. On top of that, Family Guy generates revenue across an enormous range of secondary markets. It runs in constant repeat on Adult Swim, Comedy Central, FXX, and other cable channels. each of which pays for the right to air it. It streams on Hulu, which provides another revenue stream. It has generated 25-plus years of merchandise, toys, clothing, video games, phone cases, novelty items of every conceivable description, each of which adds to the total. It has substantial value internationally, where the show airs in dozens of markets. The show does not need 12 million viewers to be profitable. It needs to be cheap enough to produce and widespread enough in its secondary markets that the numbers still work. At 723,000 viewers per episode, Family Guy is not a flagship program, but it is still a profitable one, and profitable programs do not get canceled. The April 2025 renewal deal, a 4-season commitment with the show's parent company Disney, extending the series through the 2028 to 2029 season and the show's 30th anniversary, confirmed this logic explicitly. The show is being locked in for years. Each season will consist of 15 episodes. The business case is solid enough that the question of creative quality is essentially irrelevant to the show's continued existence. It will keep going because it is cheap, and because the ecosystem it has built over a quarter-century generates income that does not depend on first-run ratings. MacFarlane's own relationship with Fox has been complicated and publicly fraught. He is on record, in a 2021 social media post, comparing his relationship with the network to a failing marriage. He has expressed discomfort with the association between Fox Broadcasting and Fox News, which are separate operations but share a corporate family and a history. He signed a deal with NBC Universal in 2020, reportedly worth around $200 million over 5 years, which moved his production company's new projects away from Fox entirely. His newer series, The Orville, the Ted prequel for Peacock, are being made for platforms that have nothing to do with Fox. Family Guy is, in this context, something of an anomaly, a show that MacFarlane created and that bears his name and his voice, airing on a network that he has publicly expressed ambivalence about, under creative leadership that is not his own. In April of 2024, when he spoke about the show's future, he framed its continuation not in terms of creative ambition, but in terms of the good things the revenue enables: environmental conservation through organizations like Rainforest Trust, the ability to fund causes he cares about, the show as a mechanism for doing good in the world, rather than as a creative endeavor in its own right. That is not a damning framing, it is an honest one. But it tells you something about where the show sits in its creator's understanding of his own work, and that something has implications for everything that appears on screen. Section 12. What lives at the bottom of the iceberg? We have come a long way from the surface. The water around us is very dark now, and the pressure is different down here. The things that live at the bottom of the iceberg are not the things that most people think about when they think about Family Guy, and some of them are stranger and more interesting and more genuinely moving than anything the casual viewer would expect to find. Start with something that sounds almost too extraordinary to be true. In the early development of the show, before the pilot, before the Super Bowl premiere, before any of the history we have traced, Seth MacFarlane was working on the show's concept with a $50,000 budget from Fox and a 15-minute time limit. He was 24 years old. He had a clear vision of what the show should be and a limited amount of time and money to demonstrate that vision to people who had not yet seen it. The pilot that MacFarlane produced, not the episode that aired, but the internal presentation reel he made for Fox, is substantially different from the first episode that audiences actually saw. The characters look different. Some of the voices are in slightly different registers. The overall aesthetic has a rougher, more experimental quality. This pilot reel exists and has been seen by people with access to the production archives, but it has never been released publicly in any official capacity. It sits in the vaults of Fox as an artifact of the show's origins, a parallel Family Guy that was transformed into the show we know. The existence of that reel is a reminder that the Family Guy we know was not inevitable. It was a specific set of choices made under specific circumstances by a specific young man with a specific vision, and at several points in its early development, it could have become something entirely different. There is also the matter of the show's relationship with its own violence, which has not been discussed as candidly within the industry as it perhaps should have been. The show's escalation of violence over its run from the cartoon slapstick of the early seasons to the increasingly graphic and realistic depictions of injury and death in the later ones mirrors a broader trend in animated comedy that is worth examining carefully. The violence in the early seasons was funny because it was cartoonish. Nobody was really getting hurt in the way the images suggested, because the images were clearly not real. As the animation became more detailed and more sophisticated, and as the show's willingness to depict graphic content increased, the distance between the images and the reality they depicted narrowed. What begins as slapstick can, over enough years and enough escalation, become something that requires a different conversation. This is not a moral argument about whether the violence is wrong. It is an observation about what happens to the register of humor when the visual language around it changes. The jokes of the early seasons and the jokes of the later seasons may share superficial similarities, but they are operating in different registers, and some of what seems like declining quality in the later material is actually a mismatch between the show's inherited visual language and the things it is now using that language to depict. The deepest part of the iceberg is also where the show's relationship with its own legacy lives. Family Guy has produced more than 450 episodes as of the mid-2020s. It has been running continuously for more than a quarter century. Within that volume of material, there is more variation than any single narrative about the show's decline can accommodate. There are episodes in the later seasons that are genuinely extraordinary pieces of work. There are episodes in the early seasons that are mediocre or worse. The show is not a monolith, and the story of its decline is not a story of uniform deterioration but of something more complicated, of the distribution of excellence thinning out, of the conditions that produce the extraordinary becoming less reliably available. The Stewie spin-off, announced in early 2026 for the 2027 to 2028 season, is perhaps the most interesting development in the show's recent history. The premise: Stewie expelled from his preschool and forced to enroll in a less prestigious one, where he deploys his devices to take classmates on adventures through time and space, is a return to something closer to the original conception of the character. A small person with extraordinary capabilities doing extraordinary things in ordinary settings. Whether it can recover something of what made early Stewie so distinctive, and whether the creative conditions around it will allow for the kind of sustained quality that the original show managed at its best, are questions that cannot be answered yet. MacFarlane co-created the spin-off with Kirker Butler as showrunner. MacFarlane's own quote about the project, delivered with characteristic dry wit, was that he was excited to start pretending he was collaborating closely with Fox on the show. The joke is a small window into a large and long history of creative ambivalence. He is still there. He is still engaged enough to make this. But the ironic distance in his phrasing suggests that the relationship between creator and creation, and between creator and network, has not resolved itself into anything more comfortable than it has been for years. What makes Family Guy genuinely fascinating, at the bottom of the iceberg, is not the controversy or the decline or the business logic that keeps it going. It is the original vision that started it. The 24-year-old with a $50,000 budget and a collection of voices and a set of characters who were alive in his imagination and who needed to be brought into the world. The Life of Larry, made in a dorm room at the Rhode Island School of Design. Larry and Steve, broadcast on a children's cable network. A 15-minute reel for Fox executives. A pilot, a Super Bowl premiere. 22 million viewers on the first night. The show that exists now is not the show that started then. But the show that started then is still in here somewhere, if you go looking. It is in the voice that MacFarlane still provides for these characters, the Peter Griffin, who is somehow both a different person than the one from Season 2, and unmistakably the same voice, the same instrument, shaped by the same hands. It is in the moments when the writing room produces something that breaks the usual pattern and finds its way to genuine feeling or genuine originality. It is in the episodes that sit at the bottom of the iceberg and resist the easy categories of quality and decline, and remind you that this is a show about people who love each other clumsily and incompletely and in spite of themselves. The Iceberg is not a story of failure. It is a story of 25 years of a real thing, a thing with a specific origin, a specific voice, specific characters who were built with care and then changed and sometimes improved and sometimes diminished, always moving forward, always accumulating more. The deep water is full of it. You could spend a long time down here and not see all of it. But the water is warm if you have been here long enough. And the dark is comfortable. And there is something almost peaceful about sitting at the bottom of something this large and this complicated and this genuinely human, even when the humans in question are a cartoon family in a made-up town in Rhode Island. The iceberg keeps going. The show keeps going. The story keeps going. And somewhere, in a dorm room that exists only in the past, a 20-year-old is making a short film about a man named Larry and his talking dog Steve, and he has no idea what any of it is going to become. If you made it all the way down here through every layer, every secret, every story that lives beneath the surface of one of the most recognizable animated shows ever made, then thank you for spending this time in the dark with this material. There is something genuinely special about the kind of attention that a long, slow exploration like this requires, and the fact that you gave it means something. If you enjoyed the journey, a like and a subscribe keeps this kind of work alive and makes it possible to go this deep again on another subject. The world is full of icebergs waiting to be explored, and there is nowhere better to explore them than somewhere quiet, in the dark, with nowhere else to be. Sleep well. The water is calm up here. End of script. Section 1 Extended. The geography of the fictional world. There is a specific pleasure in understanding the geography of a fictional world, in knowing where things are in relation to each other, which streets connect to which, where the characters are physically located when the scenes that define them are taking place. The fictional town where Family Guy is set has a geography that is less thoroughly mapped than The Simpsons' Springfield, but more internally consistent than most people give it credit for. The house at 31 Spooner Street sits in a residential neighborhood on a quiet block. The Drunken Clam Bar, where Peter and his friends spend a significant portion of their social lives, is close enough to walk to. The brewery where Peter works is on the other side of town. James Woods Regional High School, where Meg and Chris attend, sits in a district that the show has depicted enough times to have a consistent feeling, even if the specific architectural details have shifted over the seasons. What is interesting about the fictional geography is less its spatial accuracy than its emotional logic. The show is set in New England for specific reasons. Rhode Island, as a state, has a particular cultural texture, working class in its roots, post-industrial in its economics, possessed of a specific accent and a specific way of relating to the world that McFarlane drew on explicitly when designing Peter Griffin. The small state quality of Rhode Island, the sense that everyone knows everyone, that the world is close and a little claustrophobic, that the same people circulate through the same spaces, is part of the show's DNA in ways that are not always explicitly acknowledged, but are always present in the texture of the storytelling. The show has made jokes about its own setting throughout its run, acknowledging the oddness of its fictional geography and occasionally breaking the fourth wall to comment on it. But the setting is not arbitrary. It is the specific place that produced the specific people the show is about. And understanding that connection helps explain why the show felt so particular and so grounded in its early seasons before the setting became more of a backdrop than a character in its own right. The Drunken Clam, perhaps the most significant location in the show outside the Griffin house itself, became the subject of a remarkable real-world development in 2025 when the Family Guy Experience, an immersive pop-up bar installation, brought the Drunken Clam to physical existence in several American cities. The pop-up debuted in Los Angeles and Houston before coming to Boston in July of 2025, where it was installed in the basement of West End Johnny's on Portland Street. Tickets started at approximately $18 and included a 90-minute reservation and a welcome cocktail, along with access to recreations of various show locations: the Griffin family's living room, the Quahog 5 News set, Chris's bedroom, complete with the evil monkey in the closet, Stewie's time machine. The cocktail menu was elaborately themed. Drinks included the Evil Monkey Tequila, Cassis Berry, Jalapeno Tincture, the Cool W Hip, a reference to one of the show's most beloved recurring gags, and the Shut Up Meg infused gin with honey and lemon. The food menu was named after the fictional Eat My Junk food truck and included the Good Old-Fashioned Value Burger and Greased Up Deaf Fries, both references to recurring jokes in the show's universe. The fact that the Drunken Clam exists now as a real place people can visit, however temporarily, is a reflection of something interesting about how deeply embedded in popular culture this fictional bar has become. It has the status of cultural shorthand, a reference that almost anyone who has spent time around Family Guy will recognize immediately, a specific kind of dive bar with specific qualities that the show has depicted often enough and consistently enough that its character feels as real as any actual bar's character. Making it physical was not a creative decision about the show, but a commercial decision about its cultural equity, and the fact that the commercial decision was viable says something about how much of that equity has accumulated. The Boston pop-up was specifically chosen because the show is set in Rhode Island. The The show's fictional town is adjacent enough to Boston's cultural orbit that bringing the experience to the actual city nearest to the fictional one felt appropriate rather than arbitrary. The organization running the experience noted that Boston had shown unusual enthusiasm compared to other markets, which makes sense given the regional specificity of what Family Guy was always about. Section 3 Extended. The character of Herbert and the show's relationship with its own darkness. There is a character in Family Guy who represents one of the most genuinely difficult things the show has ever done, and whose continued presence across multiple decades of episodes is one of the more uncomfortable aspects of the show's history. That character is Herbert, the elderly neighbor who is depicted throughout the show as having a sexual interest in children, specifically in Chris Griffin. Herbert first appeared in Season 2 and quickly became a recurring presence in the show's universe. He is voiced by Mike Henry with a specific and precisely calibrated register, a slow, reedy, slightly trembling voice that carries within it the suggestion of age and infirmity, and also, beneath that, something considerably more threatening. He watches Chris from his porch. He finds reasons to be wherever Chris is. His interactions with Chris are consistently framed in ways that make his interest explicit while keeping the actual content of that interest in the space of implication rather than depiction. The show uses Herbert as a source of comedy. This is the genuinely uncomfortable thing about him, not that the character exists, but that the show deploys him for laughs. The jokes around Herbert rely on the audience's recognition of what he is, and on the expectation that nothing he is interested in will actually happen. He is funny, the show's logic goes, because the threat he represents is neutralized by the format. He is in a cartoon. The status quo will be maintained. Nothing bad will actually occur. This logic is not without some validity in the context of absurdist cartoon comedy. But it is also a logic that requires the audience to hold the content at a specific distance, to engage with the character's predatory qualities as a performance rather than as anything with real consequences. Over the show's long run, the question of whether that distance is being maintained consistently or whether the joke is occasionally landing closer to its subject than the format can safely handle is one that the show has never addressed directly. Herbert is among the show's most frequently cited examples by critics who argue that Family Guy's relationship with dark material is not always as controlled as the show's defenders maintain. The defense is that Herbert's continued failure to act on his interests, and the show's consistent framing of him as a figure of menace, without ever depicting actual harm, constitutes a form of satire, an exposure of a type rather than a normalization of behavior. The critique is that normalizing the type as a source of comedy, regardless of whether any harm is depicted, has its own costs that the show has not fully reckoned with. This is not a debate that has a clean resolution, and the show has never sought one. Herbert has continued to appear in episodes across all of the show's subsequent seasons, never resolving or changing, always positioned in the same relationship to Chris and the same relationship to the audience's laughter. He is one of the show's most consistent presences, and one of its most genuinely unresolved ones. Section 5 Extended. Seth MacFarlane and the Orville as creative counterbalance. One of the more illuminating ways to understand what Family Guy became in its later years is to look at what Seth MacFarlane was doing creatively at the same time, specifically at the Orville, the science fiction series he created, wrote, directed, and starred in, which premiered on Fox in 2017 and later moved to Hulu. The Orville is, in almost every measurable way, the opposite of what Family Guy had become by the time it launched. It is carefully constructed, emotionally sincere, committed to character consistency and genuine consequences. Its humor is present but subordinate to its storytelling, functioning the way good humor in drama functions as relief, as texture, as a way of making the characters feel human, rather than as the primary purpose of the enterprise. It engages with complex moral and social questions with real seriousness, and it expects its audience to engage with those questions seriously in return. The contrast is significant, because it reveals something about where MacFarlane's actual creative ambitions were sitting during the period when Family Guy was becoming the version of itself that disappointed its most dedicated early fans. He was not creatively dormant. He was not running out of ideas. He was applying his creative energy to a project that was fundamentally different in its relationship to storytelling and character, and the difference between the Orville's approach and Family Guy's late-period approach is impossible to attribute simply to the passage of time or the difficulty of maintaining quality over long production runs. The Orville is a show that MacFarlane made under the conditions that allow a creator to care about every element of the work: a smaller audience, commitment, a later move to a streaming platform that gave him more creative freedom, a personal investment in the material that is visible in every episode. It is, by many critical assessments, the best work he has done in television. And it was being made simultaneously with the Family Guy seasons that represent the show's most consistent, critical, and popular decline. This is not a condemnation of anyone. It is simply an observation about where creative energy goes when a creator has more than one project, and about what happens to the project that receives less of it. Family Guy did not decline because MacFarlane ran out of things to say. It declined because the things he had to say were going somewhere else. Section 7. Extended: The real inspirations for Quahog's supporting cast. Beyond the central Griffin family, the supporting cast of Family Guy contains a rich collection of characters whose origins in real people and real types are worth exploring. The show's secondary and tertiary characters often reveal as much about the world MacFarlane and the writing team were drawing on as the central family does. Joe Swanson, the wheelchair-using police officer who is one of Peter's core friends, was introduced in the pilot episode as a neighbor who moves in next door to the Griffins. His first episode, A Hero Sits Next Door, positions him as the cool, capable new arrival who immediately attracts admiration from everyone in the neighborhood, including Peter. Peter's jealousy of Joe in that first episode is one of the more interesting character dynamics in the early seasons. The way the show sets up Peter's competitive insecurity about another man's capabilities, even capabilities that Joe has achieved under conditions of extraordinary difficulty. Joe is a paraplegic who became so in the line of duty as a police officer. The show has been inconsistent over the years about the specific incident that caused his injury. Different episodes have offered different origin stories. That cannot all be simultaneously true, but the emotional core of his character has been consistent for much longer. A man of enormous physical capability who cannot access that capability in the way he once could, and who is defined by his relationship to the gap between what he was and what he is. His voice is provided by Patrick Warburton, with a quality of controlled intensity, a voice that sounds like it is constantly on the edge of exertion, as though every syllable is being forced through a body that is working harder than it appears. What happened to Joe over the course of the show's run mirrors what happened to Peter, Brian, and the rest of the central cast. The flanderization that flattened three-dimensional characters into two-dimensional vehicles for their most cartoonish qualities. Joe, who in the early seasons was someone the other characters genuinely respected and occasionally feared, became over time more predominantly a subject of mockery, someone whose disability was treated as a source of comedy in ways that moved further from the nuanced and further toward the exploitative as the seasons progressed. His marriage to Bonnie, which was complicated and interesting in the early seasons, became a source of sustained misery that the show never adequately resolved or examined. Cleveland Brown's journey is different because it involved the real-world recasting we have already discussed. But it is also worth noting that Cleveland was always, in the early seasons, the most overtly sensible and emotionally regulated of Peter's friends. He was the one who brought a moderating influence to the group dynamic, the voice of reason who was less effective than Brian but who was attempting the same function. His departure for the Cleveland show removed that moderating presence from the core group, and the subsequent dynamic at the Drunken Clam, with Joe becoming more passive and Quagmire becoming more dominant, is partly a consequence of that absence. Quagmire's development over the show's run is its own complicated story. In the early seasons, as we have noted, there was a satirical edge to his characterization, a sense that the show was using him to expose and mock a specific kind of retrograde masculinity. As the show progressed, that satirical edge was increasingly difficult to locate. Quagmire became more simply himself, his worldview presented with less critical distance than the original conception suggested was intended. The speech he delivers to Brian in Season 8, the famous articulation of all the reasons Quagmire genuinely despises Brian, is interesting precisely because it positions Quagmire as a moral authority on Brian's failures, which is an odd choice given that Quagmire's own behavior is at least as ethically problematic as anything Brian has done. The show seems to have forgotten, or decided to overlook, the implied critique in using Quagmire as a moral mirror. Section 9 Extended: The production mechanics nobody thinks about. Most viewers of an animated television show think about the characters and the jokes and the stories. Very few think about the mechanics of how the thing gets made. the specific production pipeline that takes a written script through voice recording, animation, editing, and eventual broadcast. The mechanics of Family Guy's production are interesting in their own right, and they have shaped the show's content in ways that are not always obvious. The voice recording sessions for Family Guy are conducted separately from the animation. The actors come into a studio and record their lines, and the animation is then produced to match the recorded audio. This is standard for American animation, but significantly different from how animation is done in some other traditions, and it has specific consequences for how the show sounds and feels. Because the actors are in the booth alone or in small groups rather than recording together in a room where they can see each other and react to each other in real time, the dialogue has a particular quality, precise and individually performed, rather than arising from genuine interaction. MacFarlane himself provides the voices for Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire in the same sessions, which means that he is regularly performing multiple characters who have conversations with each other. The logistics of this are managed through the production schedule, but it means that MacFarlane is, in the recording booth, essentially acting out scenes both sides of which he is responsible for. This is a remarkable act of creative compartmentalization, maintaining distinct vocal and character identities for four very different people, while simultaneously having those people interact with each other. The animation for Family Guy is primarily produced overseas, in South Korean studios that specialize in American animation. This is a standard practice in the industry. The majority of American animated television shows are drawn and colored in studios in South Korea or other Asian countries, with the American production teams handling the scripts, voice work, and overall creative direction. The overseas studios work from detailed storyboards and character sheets that specify how each character should move and look in each scene. This production model has evolved significantly over the show's history. In the early seasons, the process was less digitally integrated than it is now. Drawings were made on paper, colored by hand or by early digital tools, and sent back and forth through a production pipeline that was slower and more labor-intensive than what exists today. The transition to fully digital production changed the look of the show in subtle ways that fans who watch the early and late seasons back-to-back can often identify without necessarily being able to articulate what they are seeing. The lines are cleaner in the digital era. The colors are more consistent. The movement is smoother and more controlled. What is sometimes lost is the organic quality that the older production process provided, the slight imperfection that made the animation feel alive in a way that precision does not always replicate. The show has also undergone significant changes in how it handles continuity, or, more precisely, in how little it handles it. In the early seasons, there was a team of story editors whose job included tracking what had been established in previous episodes and ensuring that subsequent episodes did not contradict those established facts in ways that would confuse or alienate dedicated viewers. As the show's production volume increased and the pressure to generate episodes quickly became more intense, the continuity tracking became looser. The result is a show whose internal history is full of contradictions, characters who have different origin stories in different episodes, events that are referenced inconsistently, facts about the world that change between seasons without any acknowledgement that they have changed. Some of this is deliberate. The show has always been comfortable with the idea that its universe operates by its own logic, and that logic has never been strictly consistent. But some of it is simply the product of a long-running production that does not have the resources to maintain tight continuity across more than 400 episodes. The Iceberg is partly made of these contradictions, the gaps between what the show established and what it later showed, the questions that have no internal answers because nobody was keeping track carefully enough to ensure that answers were provided. Section 11 Extended: MacFarlane's Other Ventures and Their Relationship to Family Guy. Understanding the full context of Seth MacFarlane's relationship with Family Guy in its later years requires understanding what else he was doing and has done during the same period, because the range of his other projects illuminates the specific quality of his engagement with the show that made him famous. The movie Ted, which MacFarlane wrote, directed, produced, and starred in, was released in 2012 and became one of the most commercially successful rated comedies ever made, earning over $500 million worldwide against a production budget of approximately $50 million. The film starred Mark Wahlberg as a man whose childhood teddy bear, brought to life through a wish, has grown into a foul-mouthed, pot-smoking adult companion who complicates Wahlberg's attempts to mature into a responsible adult. The premise is clearly related to McFarlane's animated sensibility, the talking animal, the arrested development, the comedy built on the gap between childish things and adult consequences, but executed in live action, with the particular texture that live action provides. The success of Ted was significant for several reasons beyond the box office. It demonstrated that McFarlane's specific sensibility was poured about beyond animation, that it worked in live action, and that it had commercial appeal that extended well beyond the existing Family Guy audience. It also gave McFarlane the kind of Hollywood credibility that animated television, however successful, does not automatically provide the credibility of having made a massively profitable theatrical film that studios would want to develop sequels to, and that would attract major stars to future projects. A Million Ways to Die in the West, his follow-up directorial effort released in 2014, it was considerably less successful. It earned modestly against its budget and received mixed reviews, but it confirmed his ambition to continue working in live action. Ted 2, released in 2015, returned to the successful formula and performed well enough commercially, if not quite at the level of the original. The Orville, which we have already discussed at some length, represented a different kind of ambition entirely. Not the commercial calculation of a franchise sequel, but a genuine personal creative investment in a genre that McFarlane had loved since childhood. Science fiction, particularly the optimistic, exploratory science fiction of the Star Trek tradition, clearly means something specific and deep to him, and The Orville is the show that most directly expresses that meaning. What all of these projects share is the quality of genuine creative investment, the sense that McFarlane was fully present in the work, that his specific sensibility was actively shaping every decision, that the projects bore the mark of someone who cared about the outcome. This quality is not uniformly present in his Family Guy work of the corresponding period. The contrast suggests not that McFarlane is a creator who has declined, but that he is a creator whose creative energy has distributed itself across multiple projects in ways that Family Guy has received less and less of over time. Section 12. Extended. The future of the Family Guy universe. The announcement of the Stewie spin-off in early 2026, with its 2-season order and its target premiere date in the 2027 to 2028 television season, represents the most significant expansion of the Family Guy universe since the Cleveland Show. It also represents something slightly different from a standard spin-off. Because Stewie Griffin is not a peripheral character being given his own space, he is arguably the show's most culturally significant creation, the character most associated with Family Guy's specific genius in the minds of people who know the show's history. The premise of the Stewie spin-off is worth examining closely, because it tells you something about how the character is being understood at this stage of the franchise's history. After being expelled from his old preschool, Stewie is forced to enroll in a less prestigious institution, attended by kids he does not know, and presided over by a 75-year-old class turtle with elaborate and usually wrong opinions about every subject. Stewie deploys his array of devices to take his classmates on adventures through space and time, turning what would otherwise be a miserable educational experience into something extraordinary. This premise does a specific thing. It returns Stewie's technology to the foreground. The time machine, the devices, the capacity to reshape reality through applied genius. These have been present in the character throughout his history, but have been used less consistently and less centrally in the years since the character's pivot away from villainy. The spin-off premise puts them back at the center of Stewie's story, while placing them in the service of relationships and community rather than of domination or destruction. The turtle character is an interesting addition. A 75-year-old class turtle with half-cocked theories about everything is, structurally speaking, the kind of character that exists to be wrong in interesting ways, a vehicle for the show to explore ideas and get them wrong on purpose, with the comedy arising from the gap between the turtle's confidence and the inaccuracy of its positions. Whether it will function as a genuine comedic creation or as a shortcut to a specific kind of joke remains to be seen. Kirker Butler, who will serve as showrunner, has worked with McFarlane on multiple previous projects and brings experience with the specific comedic and narrative sensibilities that Family Guy-adjacent content requires. The 2-season order from Fox suggests that the network is committing to the project in a serious way, rather than treating it as an experiment that might be canceled quickly if the initial response is uncertain. What the spin-off cannot be predicted to do is recover whatever was genuinely irreplaceable about the original conception of Stewie Griffin. The evil genius baby plotting to murder his mother and conquer the world was a specific thing, specific enough that it could not be reproduced in a different format, with a different supporting cast and expect to feel like the same thing. The Stewie who goes on time travel adventures with his preschool classmates will be recognizably the same character in voice and vocabulary and general intelligence, but the specific comedic engine that powered the early seasons of Family Guy, the gap between Stewie's reality and the adult's inability to perceive it, the sustained threat of genuine harm from the most harmless-looking possible source, that engine cannot be simply restarted after 20-plus years of being something else. The question the spin-off will answer is whether there is a different engine available, whether the specific configuration of Stewie plus extraordinary technology plus ordinary setting plus unusual supporting cast can generate something genuinely new, rather than something that feels like a continuation of what the character has been since the middle of the show's run. MacFarlane's own sardonic comment about looking forward to pretending to collaborate closely with Fox on the show does not suggest that he is approaching the project with straightforward enthusiasm, though irony of that kind from MacFarlane does not necessarily indicate the absence of genuine investment. The Family Guy universe in 2026 is a considerably larger and more architecturally complex thing than it was when a 24-year-old Seth MacFarlane presented a 15-minute pilot reel to Fox executives in 1998. It includes a main series that has run for 27 seasons and will run for at least several more. It includes a completed spin-off in The Cleveland Show. It includes the crossover episode with The Simpsons. It includes the direct-to-video film. It includes the video games, the merchandise, the pop-up bar experiences, and now a new spin-off built around its most iconic character. Whether any of what comes next will matter in the way that the early seasons mattered, whether anything produced in this universe can capture the specific combination of intelligence and warmth and formal innovation that made Family Guy genuinely new in 1999, is a question that cannot be answered in advance. What can be said is that the universe is still generating new material, that there are people within it who are still trying to make something worthwhile, and that the history we have traced through this iceberg is long enough and rich enough that new entries in it will always have something meaningful to work against. Section 2 Extended. The Adult Swim Years and Why They Mattered So Much. The period between 2003 and 2005, when Family Guy was airing exclusively as reruns on Adult Swim, was not simply a holding pattern. It was, in retrospect, one of the most important periods in the show's entire history, a time when the show's relationship with its audience was fundamentally reshaped in ways that would determine everything about how the revival was received and what the show subsequently became. Adult Swim in 2003 was a specific cultural environment. The block had been running since 2001 and had developed its own aesthetic identity, an identity built around weird, dark, knowing humor aimed at young adults who were watching television late at night and who were looking for something that felt more alive and more honest than primetime programming. The block's own original productions, shows like Aqua Teen Hunger Force, Harvey Birdman Attorney at Law, and Space Ghost Coast to Coast, had established a particular register of absurdist, self-aware comedy that attracted a specific and intensely loyal audience. Family Guy fit into this environment surprisingly well, because the sensibility it had developed in its original run had more in common with the Adult Swim aesthetic than with the primetime Fox animation that surrounded it in its original time slot. The show was dark in ways that The Simpsons was not. It was self-aware in ways that King of the Hill was not. It had a relationship with its own absurdity that felt genuinely anarchic rather than calculated. When it landed in the Adult Swim schedule, the audience that was already there for the block's original programming recognized something familiar in it and responded accordingly. The demographic that discovered Family Guy through Adult Swim was different in important ways from the demographic that had watched it on Fox during its original run. The Super Bowl premiere had given the show an enormous and extremely diverse audience, millions of people of all ages and backgrounds who happened to be watching television on that particular Sunday night. The audience that built through Adult Swim was more specifically selected, younger, more likely to be watching late at night, more likely to have already developed a taste for the block's specific kind of humor, more likely to approach Family Guy with precisely the interpretive frame that its more transgressive content required. This demographic difference had consequences for how the show was understood and what it was understood to be. The Adult Swim audience read Family Guy as a cult show, something that the mainstream had failed to appreciate, something that a discerning subset of viewers had discovered despite the indifference of the institutions that had been supposed to promote it. This reading gave the show an underdog quality that it had not possessed during its original Fox run, and that underdog quality is part of what fueled the intensity of the fan campaign that contributed to its revival. There is something interesting about how a show's identity can be reshaped by the context in which it is consumed. Family Guy had always had the qualities that Adult Swim viewers responded to, but those qualities had been embedded in a primetime network context that situated the show as a family viewing option, however adult its humor was. The Adult Swim context removed that framing entirely and presented the show as precisely the kind of post-midnight programming that required and rewarded attention. The DVD sales that accompanied the Adult Swim run are also worth examining more carefully than the summary version of the story usually allows. The DVDs sold in a specific way, not just well, but persistently. The sales built over time rather than spiking and declining, which suggested that people were recommending the product to others rather than simply buying it as completists. The word of mouth that drove DVD sales in that period was the most reliable form of cultural transmission that existed before streaming. Made everything simultaneously available. You either sought something out actively, or someone who had already sought it out told you about it, and you chose to follow their recommendation. The people who bought those DVDs were making a specific kind of commitment. They were investing in the physical ownership of something they valued. That kind of commitment creates a particular quality of investment in the object. The person who owns a thing relates to it differently from the person who can access it on demand, and the relationship that the Adult Swim audience and the DVD buying audience developed with Family Guy during the gap between its cancellation and its revival was more intense and more personal than the relationship that the primetime Fox audience had developed with it. The people who were responsible for bringing the show back were not the mass audience of the original run. They were the devoted minority who had gone out of their way to remain connected to it. Section 4 Extended. The history of censorship around Family Guy and the Parents Television Council. No history of Family Guy would be complete without addressing the Parents Television Council, an American media watchdog organization that made the show one of its most consistent targets throughout the early and middle years of its run. The PTC's ongoing conflict with Family Guy is one of the more interesting institutional stories in the show's history, because it illustrates the specific nature of the cultural battles that the show was engaged in and the specific opposition those battles generated. The Parents Television Council was founded in 1995 and positions itself as an advocacy organization working to protect families from content it considers harmful or inappropriate. It maintains a list of what it considers the best and worst shows on American primetime television, and it has been a persistent filer of complaints with the Federal Communications Commission about content it believes violates decency standards. Over the years, the FCC has received thousands of complaints about Family Guy. Not all of them from PTC members, but a significant portion. The PTC placed Family Guy on its list of worst primetime programs for family viewing in 2000, 2005, and 2006. These designations came with detailed rationales explaining what specific content the organization found: objectionable violence, sexual references, religious mockery, crude language, and what it described as the normalization of antisocial behavior through comedy. The organization campaigned for the show to be canceled and for advertisers to pull their support. The show's response to this opposition was characteristically irreverent. It made jokes about the PTC, it made jokes about censorship, it made jokes about the kind of audience that the PTC represented. In doing so, it was doing what it had always done with cultural opposition, absorbing it and converting it into material. The PTC was not wrong to notice that Family Guy was doing things that primetime broadcast television had generally not done before. It was making choices about the significance of those things and the appropriate response to them that the show and many of its viewers disagreed with. The FCC complaints about Family Guy generated some notable administrative outcomes. The Commission received substantial numbers of complaints following particularly controversial episodes, and while it rarely took formal action against the show, the existence of the complaint process created a kind of ongoing institutional pressure on Fox to manage the show's content. Fox's own Standards and Practices Department reviewed Family Guy material as it was being developed, and some content was flagged and modified before broadcast, though the specifics of those internal negotiations are not publicly documented. What makes the PTC story interesting in the context of the Iceberg is what it reveals about the show's relationship with social conflict. Family Guy was always, at some level, a show about cultural conflict, about the clash between different kinds of values, different ideas about what is acceptable and what is funny, and what the appropriate limits of comedy are. The PTC's opposition was not simply an external inconvenience. It was, in a strange way, part of the show's ecosystem. Having an institutional opponent who was clearly, visibly, dramatically wrong about the show's value gave the show's defenders a clarity of purpose that is harder to maintain against more nuanced criticism. When the argument against Family Guy is simply that it is offensive and that offensive things should not be on television, the argument is easy to rebut. Humor has always engaged with the offensive. Comedy has always operated in the space between what is said and what is unsayable. And the history of artistic censorship is largely a history of being wrong about which things needed to be suppressed. When the argument against Family Guy is more specific that it lost its satirical edge, that its transgression became purposeless, that it confused being shocking with being meaningful, the argument is harder to dismiss. The PTC was making the simple argument. The more sophisticated critique came later, from people who had once loved the show. Section 6. Extended. The road to episodes and what they represent. Among the most beloved and most consistently praised elements of the show's revival-era production are the Road to episodes, special episodes featuring Brian and Stewie embarking on some form of journey or adventure. Together, usually with a road to somewhere as the title, a format derived from the classic Bob Hope and Bing Crosby road movie series of the 1940s and 1950s. The Road to episodes began with Road to Rhode Island in Season 2 of the original run, in which Brian and Stewie travel across the country after Stewie is stranded at his grandparents' house in Florida. The episode established several things that would define the format going forward. Brian and Stewie alone together, without the rest of the family to provide context or comic counterpoint. A genuine journey with real stakes, however comedically presented, and an emotional dimension that the show's ordinary episodic format did not typically accommodate. The relationship between Brian and Stewie was still relatively new in that episode, and the journey gave it room to develop in ways that the usual Griffin House setting would not have permitted. Subsequent Road to episodes, Road to Europe, Road to Rupert, Road to the Multiverse, Road to the North Pole, and several others each took the basic format and pushed it in a different direction. Road to the Multiverse, as we have already discussed, used the format as a vehicle for dimensional travel and animated pastiche. Road to the North Pole took the format into territory that was, for the show, unusually dark and emotionally ambitious. A Christmas episode in which Brian and Stewie's attempt to visit the real Santa Claus reveals a figure whose resources are completely overwhelmed by the impossible scale of what people ask of him. What the Road to format did, consistently, was create conditions in which the show's best qualities could operate without the constraints that the regular episodic format imposed. When Brian and Stewie are on a journey together, the show is freed from the requirement to service the entire ensemble. It is freed from the requirement to include cutaway gags at regular intervals. It is freed from the status quo maintenance that the regular format demands. It can tell a story that builds from beginning to end, that changes the characters in ways that feel genuine and lasting, even if those changes are subsequently undone by the regular format's requirements, and that uses the specific chemistry between Brian and Stewie in ways that the ordinary episodes do not always allow. The Road to episodes are not perfect. Some of them reach for emotional depth and do not quite achieve it. Some of them rely on animated pastiche in ways that are more technically impressive than genuinely funny. Some of them are better than others in ways that are difficult to predict from their premises. But they represent, collectively, the clearest example of what Family Guy could do when it was given the room and the permission to try something different from its default mode. The format has continued into the show's most recent seasons, and while the later Road to episodes have not always matched the earlier ones in quality, their continued presence in the production schedule suggests that the writing staff recognizes their value as a different kind of creative space, a place where different rules apply and different things are possible. Section 8 Extended. The Simpsons comparison and what it actually reveals. No discussion of Family Guy's Iceberg is complete without engaging seriously with the comparison to The Simpsons, the comparison that has followed Family Guy since its inception, and that has been used both as a point of attack and as a point of defense at different moments in the show's history. The relationship between the two shows is genuinely complicated. The Simpsons premiered in 1989, 9 years before Family Guy, and established so many of the conventions of adult animated sitcom that it is effectively impossible to make one without engaging with its influence. The specific configuration of the dysfunctional American family, the dim, well-meaning father, the capable and often underappreciated mother, the children with distinct and consistent comedic personas, was so thoroughly established by The Simpsons that any subsequent show working in the same territory would inevitably be measured against it. The accusation that Family Guy is a Simpsons ripoff has been made since the show's premiere and has been defended against since the show's premiere. The most cogent version of the defense is that the surface similarities, animation style, family structure, New England setting for the Griffins, specifically conceal fundamental differences in approach, humor, and emotional register. The Simpsons, at its best, was a humanist comedy built on genuine affection for its characters and a belief in the possibility of change and growth. Family Guy, at its best, was something colder and more anarchic, more willing to treat its characters as vehicles for comedy than as people deserving of genuine sympathy. This difference is not a flaw in Family Guy. It is a different approach to the same basic material. The Simpsons wanted you to love Homer in spite of his failures, to feel that his stumbling through the world was touching rather than simply comic. Family Guy was more ambivalent about whether you needed to love Peter at all. It was comfortable with the possibility that you might find him funny without finding him particularly lovable. These are different emotional contracts with the audience, and both are legitimate approaches to comedy. What is more interesting than the surface comparison, though, is the structural contrast between how the two shows have handled their longevity. The Simpsons has had its own significant decline over its extremely long run. The years following what most critics consider its golden age, roughly seasons 3 through 8 or 9, have been the subject of sustained critical disappointment that mirrors the conversation around Family Guy's later seasons. But The Simpsons' decline has been generally attributed to the inevitable challenge of maintaining creative freshness across 30-plus seasons, to the natural exhaustion of a creative team working on the same material for decades. Family Guy's decline tends to be attributed more specifically to conscious choices, to the decisions that were made about the characters, the cutaways, the shift toward shock value. The difference in how the declines are narrativized says something about what people expected from each show. The Simpsons was expected to be a genuinely ambitious piece of work, and its failure to maintain that ambition over the long run is understood as the failure of ambition under the weight of sustained production. Family Guy was never quite as clearly positioned as genuinely ambitious in the same way, which means that its decline is read through a different lens, not as the failure of ambition, but as the failure of care, the failure of the people managing the machine to keep it pointed in the right direction. Whether this difference in framing is fair to either show is a question worth sitting with. The Simpsons made choices too, and some of those choices explain its decline as clearly as any inevitable creative exhaustion. Family Guy had strengths in its early seasons that were not simply destined to erode, and the specific decisions that accelerated that erosion were not inevitable either. Both shows are stories of people making choices under pressure, and the choices that were made deserve to be evaluated as choices, rather than attributed purely to circumstance. Closing thoughts. The Iceberg continues. The deepest thing about the Family Guy iceberg is not any specific fact or story or secret. It is the cumulative experience of discovering that something you thought you understood completely, a show you grew up watching, a set of characters who felt familiar and comfortable and known, is actually significantly more complicated and more historically rich than the surface version suggested. The iceberg is always there. Every piece of long-running popular culture has one, accumulating below the waterline as the years pass and the material grows and the people behind it make decisions that shape the work in ways the audience never fully sees. Family Guy has an iceberg that is larger than most and stranger than most, partly because of the extraordinary circumstances of its production history, the cancellations and revivals, the near disaster of September 11th, the gradual departure of its creator from the work he made, and partly because the show itself was always more interested in its own depths than its surface reputation suggested. The Yellow House is still there. The stories it contains are still unfinished, because the show is still being made and the spin-off is on the way, and the franchise will continue to generate new material for years to come. The iceberg will keep growing. The bottom will keep receding, But you have been down far enough tonight to know that the bottom is real, and that what lives there is worth the descent. Thank you for making the journey. Rest well. Final word count target. 30,000 plus words. Additional layer. The voice acting craft and what it actually takes. There is something that deserves more attention in any serious exploration of Family Guy's history, and that is the extraordinary technical achievement represented by the show's voice cast. The specific skills and sustained commitments that have made the show sound the way it sounds for decades, across hundreds of episodes, through conditions that required a quality of professional consistency that audiences rarely think to appreciate. Because they are not watching the people performing, they are watching animated drawings of people performing. Seth MacFarlane voices 4 of the show's principal characters. 4. Peter Griffin, Brian Griffin, Stewie Griffin, and Glenn Quagmire are all produced by the same voice actor in the same recording sessions. From a technical standpoint, this is remarkable. Each character has a completely distinct vocal identity. The thick, labored New England drawl of Peter, the relaxed and precise cadence of Brian, the arch-British diction of Stewie, the sharp and somewhat dated lounge lizard delivery of Quagmire. These are not simply different pitches on the same voice. They are different ways of using the instrument, different physical configurations of the vocal apparatus, different approaches to timing and emphasis, and the relationship between what is being said and how it lands. MacFarlane has been producing all 4 of these voices consistently for more than a quarter century. The degree to which they remain distinct and recognizable across that span of time is a testament to the precision of his craft. Voice actors work differently from on-screen actors in ways that are not always understood. They cannot rely on physical presence, facial expression, body language, or any of the visual tools that on-screen performers use to communicate character. Everything must be carried in the voice alone, in the specific qualities of sound that distinguish one person from another, one emotional state from another, one relationship from another. Alex Borstein's sustained performance as Lois is its own remarkable achievement. Lois is a character who could easily become a one-note vehicle for exasperation. The perpetually reasonable wife, reacting to a perpetually unreasonable husband, is one of the oldest structures in situation comedy, and it carries with it the danger of flatness, of becoming a function rather than a person. Borstein has consistently prevented this from happening through a performance that finds the specific human texture of Lois in every scene, the particular way she holds herself together, the small moments of genuine frustration that break through the surface patience, the underlying warmth that never quite disappears even when the character is at her most cynical. Mila Kunis's tenure as Meg, which began in Season 2 and has continued without interruption since, represents one of the more unusual challenges in the show's voice cast. Meg is a character who, for a significant stretch of the show's history, was primarily defined by her suffering, who existed to have things done to her rather than to do things, who was a vehicle for the family's worst impulses rather than a full participant in the show's comedic life. Performing that character consistently, and without allowing the performance to become simply mechanical, requires a specific kind of craft. Kunis has spoken about the challenge of maintaining investment in a character whose role was often to absorb punishment, and the fact that her performance across even the most difficult seasons of the Meg material retains something authentic suggests that she found a way to approach the material that went beyond simply delivering lines. Patrick Warburton's Joe Swanson is perhaps the most distinctive voice in the show's secondary cast, an almost perfectly calibrated performance of a specific kind of contained intensity, a voice that sounds like physical effort rendered in sound, always on the edge of exertion in a way that is both funny and, in the character's best moments, genuinely moving. Warburton has a physicality in his voice work that is unusual, a quality of embodiment that makes Joe feel present even in a medium that has no bodies, only drawings and sounds. The guest voice performances across the show's history constitute their own archive of celebrity craft. The show has attracted performers across every category of fame and every register of performance. From genuine theatrical legends to sports figures making cameos to musicians attempting comedy, the range of quality across these appearances is considerable. But the show's best guest performances, Adam West's sustained commitment over 2 decades, Sir Ian McKellen's precise and generous work in Send in Stewie Please, James Woods playing an exaggerated version of himself with enough self-awareness to make the jokeland demonstrate what is possible when a skilled performer engages seriously with animated material. The craft of voice acting is systematically undervalued by audiences who tend to think of it as simpler and less demanding than on-screen performance. The sustained excellence of Family Guy's voice cast across more than 400 episodes through seasons of varying quality and material that was sometimes deeply challenging represents a professional achievement that deserves more acknowledgement than it typically receives. Additional layer: the music of Family Guy. One aspect of Family Guy that the Iceberg rewards careful attention to is the show's relationship with music, a relationship that is more sophisticated and more historically rooted than the average viewer tends to notice. MacFarlane's personal background in music is deep. He is a trained singer with a genuine passion for the American songbook tradition, the jazz standards and Broadway ballads and big band arrangements that dominated popular American music from the 1930s through the 1960s. He has released multiple albums of material in this tradition, working with contemporary arrangements of classic songs in ways that are clearly personal rather than merely commercial. His interest in this music is not a performance of sophistication. It is a genuine commitment. This background shapes Family Guy's musical content in specific and consistent ways. The show has produced original songs across its entire run, many of them written in the style of mid-century American popular music, Broadway pastiche, vaudeville homage, big band parody. The quality of these songs varies considerably from episode to episode, but at their best, they represent something more than simple comedy music. They are genuine engagement with a musical tradition that MacFarlane understands from the inside, and the result is comedy songs that actually work as songs that have real melodic content and real harmonic structure and real craft in their lyrics, rather than comedy songs that simply have lyrics over chords. The original song You Have AIDS, from a Season 3 episode, is a dark example of this, a cheerful barbershop-style arrangement delivering the worst possible news, with the comedy arising entirely from the gap between the form and the content. The song works as comedy because it works as a song. If the musical execution were sloppy or careless, the joke would not land. The precision of the arrangement is what makes the darkness of the content funny. The Road to Rhode Island features an extended original song called Road to Rhode Island that is a genuine piece of musical comedy, writing a duet between Brian and Stewie that works through a series of escalating declarations about the importance of their destination, with each verse building on the previous one in ways that demonstrate a real understanding of how musical comedy builds. The song has the quality of something that could work on a stage, not just as a television moment. Peter's a Prick is among the more ambitious musical moments in the later seasons, a song that manages to be both genuinely harsh in its assessment of the main character and genuinely funny, largely because the musical setting gives the harshness a formal container that transforms its tone. The show's use of pre-existing music is also worth noting. The cutaway gags frequently feature music as part of their comedy. A specific song playing over a specific image creates a specific kind of joke that the show has used with varying degrees of skill across its run. In the best instances, the music is chosen with real care. The specific associations of a particular song, the emotional register of a particular arrangement, the way that certain kinds of music carry certain expectations that the image can either confirm or subvert. In the worst instances, the music is simply wallpaper, something playing in the background of an image without any meaningful relationship to the comedy being attempted. The Conway Twitty gag, which we discussed in the transcript that provided the template for this script's approach, is the most extended example of the show's engagement with pre-existing music, and it is interesting precisely because it demonstrates both the potential and the limits of music as comedy. The first Conway Twitty performance in the show was funny because it was unexpected. The sheer incongruity of a full-length country music performance in the middle of an animated sitcom episode created a kind of bewildered laugh that was entirely about the surprise. When the gag was repeated, the surprise was gone, and what replaced it was a test of the audience's patience that the show was not always willing to moderate with judgment. Additional layer: animation history and what each studio brought. The show's visual history is one that most fans experience, but few fully articulate an evolving look that changed with each change of animation studio. And that has never been entirely consistent from season to season, though it has settled into a relatively stable digital aesthetic in the later years that makes the early variability somewhat less visible. The early seasons of Family Guy were animated by several different studios, each of which left a distinct mark on the episodes they handled. Rough Draft Studios, which handled seasons 2 and 3 and portions of other seasons, is generally identified as the studio whose work most closely matched the spirit of the show. Their episodes have a quality of looseness and energy that is specifically different from the animation of later seasons. Characters move in ways that feel slightly less constrained, faces make expressions that are more varied and more extreme. The whole visual field has an organic quality that suggests the drawings were made by people who were engaged with the material. Film Roman, which handled the show's animation in various periods, brought a different aesthetic: cleaner lines, more consistent character proportions, a slightly more polished look that sacrificed some of the rough draft looseness in exchange for technical precision. The show under Film Roman looked more professional in a certain sense, while also looking somewhat less alive in another sense. Digital Imation, which handled animation for portions of seasons 6 and 7, produced work that fans often identify as among the least successful in the show's visual history. A flatness to the character designs, a rigidity to the movement, a quality of technically competent but expressively limited work that does not serve the comedy as well as the earlier studio's approaches. These seasons are often cited in fan discussions as among the most visually inconsistent of the show's run. The transition to fully digital animation in the later seasons brought its own changes. Digital tools allow for precise control over character design and movement in ways that traditional pen and ink animation does not, and the result is a show that looks technically very clean and very consistent from episode to episode. The character models are precise. The colors are stable. Nothing looks accidental. But the accidental quality of earlier animation was sometimes part of what made it feel alive, and the precision of digital production can produce a kind of polished sterility that the rougher, earlier work did not have. This is not an argument that digital animation is inherently inferior. It is an observation about what changes when the production process changes, and about the specific ways in which the visual language of a show shapes the comedy that it carries. The physical comedy of the early seasons, the falls, the injuries, the slapstick violence worked partly because the animation of those moments had a quality of physicality, of weight and consequence, and genuine impact. As the animation became more polished and more controlled, the physical comedy became more precisely executed and, in some ways, less convincing. The technical improvement paradoxically reduced the emotional impact of the moments that most depended on the feeling of real things happening to real bodies. An additional layer, the international Family Guy. Family Guy is a genuinely global cultural product, and the story of how it has circulated internationally and how different audiences have received it is part of the iceberg that domestic American accounts of the show rarely address. The show airs in dozens of countries around the world, translated into multiple languages, and in some markets has attracted audiences that rival or exceed its American ratings in relative terms. The humor presents translation challenges that are genuinely interesting. Much of what makes Family Guy funny is specific to American cultural references, to particular television shows and movies and political figures and historical events that may not translate meaningfully to audiences in other countries. The cutaway gags in particular rely on the audience having the specific cultural knowledge that makes the contrast between the reference and the context funny. Different international versions of the show have handled these challenges differently. Some markets retain the original dialogue with subtitles, accepting that some jokes will not fully land without the cultural context they require. Some markets dub the show with adapted dialogue that substitutes locally recognizable references for American ones, attempting to preserve the comic logic of the joke even when the specific content must change. The quality of these adaptations varies considerably, and the question of how much of Family Guy's specific humor survives international distribution is one that the show's creators have not always addressed directly. The episode that came closest to causing the show to be banned from a foreign broadcaster was a Season 5 episode that included content the Venezuelan government found objectionable as a depiction of drug use that reflected poorly on American values. Venezuelan justice officials warned that cable stations would face fines if they continued to air Family Guy, and the show was effectively removed from Venezuelan television as a result. The incident is one of the more extreme examples of the show's international reception, but it is not entirely isolated. Various episodes have generated controversy in various markets for various reasons throughout the show's history. In the United Kingdom, where the BBC has been among the show's international distributors, the show has generally been received with a degree of enthusiasm that sometimes surprises American observers. The BBC's willingness to air partial terms of endearment, the episode that Fox refused to broadcast, is part of this story, but it extends beyond a single episode to a general pattern in which British audiences have sometimes been more comfortable with Family Guy's transgressive content than American audiences have been. The show's streaming presence on Disney Plus internationally has introduced it to new audiences in markets where it was previously less widely available, and the interaction between new international audiences and the show's long and complicated history is itself an ongoing story, one that the Iceberg will eventually encompass as the new viewers develop their own relationship with the material. Additional layer: the show's relationship with its own legacy. In the final years of any long-running show's production, the question of legacy becomes increasingly present not just in how critics and fans discuss the show, but in how the show discusses itself. Family Guy has been self-referential since its earliest seasons, but the nature of its self-referentiality has changed significantly as the show has become old enough to have a history worth referencing. The early self-referential moments were primarily formal jokes about the show's format, about the nature of cutaway gags, about the mechanics of animated comedy. These jokes operated from a position of confidence and relative novelty. They were the jokes of a show that was still finding its identity and that was enjoying the discovery process. The later self-referential moments are different in character jokes about the show's declining quality, about how long it has been running, about the relationship between the show and the network that airs it. These are the jokes of a show that knows its history and is not entirely comfortable with all of it. There is an episode in the later seasons called Inside Family Guy that presents itself as a behind-the-scenes documentary about the making of the show. The episode is clever in the way that Family Guy is often clever, sufficiently aware of its own mechanics to subvert them in ways that are funny to attentive viewers, sufficiently committed to its comedy to avoid the sentimentality that might otherwise accompany a show's meditation on its own history. But the episode also carries within it something that the early self-referential material did not: a quality of defensiveness, of preemptive acknowledgement that the show has become the kind of show that gets mocked for being itself. The episode Back to the Pilot, in which Brian and Stewie travel back to the events of the very first episode, is perhaps the most interesting self-referential episode in the show's history, precisely because of how it uses the show's own past as material. The characters visit the pilot. They observe their own first episode from outside it. They comment on the animation quality, on the character designs, on the narrative structure. The comedy is real and the nostalgia is real, and the distance between what the show was and what it had become, which the episode could not help but illuminate by staging the juxtaposition directly, is also real. These episodes, and there are several others like them scattered throughout the later seasons, constitute a kind of ongoing conversation that the show is having with itself about what it has become. Whether that conversation amounts to genuine reckoning with the choices that shaped the show's decline, or merely to a form of self-awareness that substitutes for actual change, is a question that different viewers answer differently depending on their investment in the show and their assessment of its later seasons. The legacy conversation is also happening outside the show, in the enormous volume of critical and fan commentary that the show has generated over its history. The Family Guy Iceberg is partly made of that commentary, the analyses and the arguments, and the comparisons and the theories that have accumulated around the show as it has grown older. The iceberg grows with every new perspective that engages seriously with the material, and the fact that serious engagement with Family Guy is still happening decades after its premiere is itself evidence that the show earned a place in the culture that its later seasons have not fully surrendered. Additional layer: the legacy of the Cleveland Show and what was lost when it ended. The Cleveland Show aired from September 2009 to May 2013, running for 4 seasons and 88 episodes. It is remembered now primarily as a footnote in the Family Guy franchise's history, the spin-off that tried and did not quite find its footing, the show that Cleveland Brown left for and eventually came back from. That characterization is unfair in certain specific ways, and exploring those unfairnesses reveals something interesting about how the broader Family Guy universe operated and about what different creative choices looked like within the same basic framework. Cleveland Brown was, in the context of Family Guy, a fundamentally mild character, the warm, steady, conflict-averse member of Peter's group of friends whose primary comic function was to respond to chaos with a kind of pained reasonableness. His relative gentleness made him something of a contrasting presence to the aggression that defined Peter, the neuroticism that characterized Joe in his worst moments, and the predatory energy of Quagmire. He was the human scale of the group. The show around him was frequently inhuman in its comedy, and Cleveland was there as a reference point for what ordinary human decency looked like. The Cleveland Show attempted to build a full animated sitcom around a character whose primary quality was his gentleness, and this was a genuinely difficult proposition. Gentleness in a lead character creates specific structural challenges for situation comedy. You need conflict to generate story, and a lead character who naturally avoids and resolves conflict, rather than creating it, requires the conflict to come from the environment, rather than from the character himself. The show addressed this partly by giving Cleveland a more assertive second wife in Donna, and by surrounding him with a stepfamily that was considerably less gentle than he was, but the challenge of making a mild man the protagonist of a comedy about chaos was never fully resolved. What the Cleveland Show did well, in its better moments, was develop Cleveland as a character with interior life beyond his function in the Family Guy ensemble. Episodes that gave him real emotional stakes, his relationship with Donna, his connection to his biological son Cleveland Jr., his sense of himself as a father figure trying to navigate a complex family situation, showed that there was a version of Cleveland Brown who could carry a story entirely on his own terms, without the Griffin family's noise and extremity to provide contrast and context. The show was also notable for its relationship to questions of race and representation in American animated comedy. Cleveland Brown is a black character in a show whose lead ensemble had been entirely white for its first decade. Moving him to a spin-off and making him the protagonist of his own show created space for a show centered on a black American family in ways that Family Guy, structured as it was around the Griffins, could not easily provide. The Cleveland Show engaged with this opportunity with varying degrees of directness and varying degrees of success across its 4 seasons. When the show ended in 2013 and Cleveland returned to Family Guy, something was quietly lost in the transition. Cleveland as a character had been developed and deepened in the spin-off in ways that Family Guy did not fully absorb when he returned. He came back more or less as he had been before he left, the mild, steady friend in the group, and the specific qualities that the spin-off had explored were not carried forward in any sustained way. The spin-off turned out not to have been a chapter in Cleveland's story so much as a parenthesis, something that opened and then closed without meaningfully changing the main text. Additional layer: the real comedy mechanics behind the cutaway. The cutaway gag is so central to Family Guy's identity that it is easy to stop thinking of it as a technique and start thinking of it as simply what the show is. But it is a technique with specific mechanics and specific creative requirements, and understanding how it works at its best and where it fails at its worst illuminates a great deal about the show's history. At its most fundamental level, a cutaway gag is a structural device that creates comedy through juxtaposition. A character says something that sets up a comparison. "This is worse than the time," or "remember when," and the show cuts to a scene that depicts the thing being compared. The comedy comes from the contrast between the current situation and the depicted one, from the absurdity or unexpectedness of what is shown, and from the rapid shift back to the main story before the digression has overstayed its welcome. The creative requirements of a good cutaway are specific. The setup needs to be clear enough that the audience understands immediately what the cutaway is supposed to be illustrating. The cutaway scene itself needs to be surprising either in what it depicts or in how it depicts it. The duration needs to be calibrated to the strength of the material. A strong gag can sustain more time, while a weaker one needs to get in and out quickly. And the transition back to the main story needs to be smooth enough that the episode's narrative momentum is not permanently lost. When all of these elements work together, the cutaway enhances the episode. It adds a dimension of comic invention that makes the main story feel richer and more varied. The audience is getting 2 things at once: the main story and the bonus gags. And when the bonus gags are good, the overall experience of the episode is better than the main story alone would provide. When these elements do not work together, when the setup is unclear, or the cutaway scene is not surprising, or the duration is misjudged, or the transition is clumsy, the cutaway actively damages the episode. It breaks the narrative momentum without providing sufficient comic reward to justify the interruption. The audience is taken out of the story and given something that is not worth the detour, and when this happens repeatedly within a single episode, the episodic structure effectively collapses into a series of disconnected moments that do not add up to a coherent experience. The history of cutaways in Family Guy is the history of a technique deployed with extraordinary skill in the early seasons, and with decreasing skill and increasing frequency in the later ones. In the early seasons, the cutaways were shaped by a room that understood the technique's requirements intuitively, that knew when a setup was strong, when a gag was surprising, when the duration was right. In the later seasons, as the room changed, and as the production pressures of a long-running series accumulated, the technique was deployed more mechanically and less skillfully. There is also the question of how the growth of internet video affected the show's relationship with the cutaway gag. YouTube launched in 2005, the same year Family Guy returned from cancellation, and in the years that followed, the ability to clip short segments from television shows and share them online fundamentally changed the way that television humor circulated. A 30-second cutaway gag that was funny in isolation could be clipped and shared and watched millions of times without any connection to the episode it came from. This created a specific incentive structure. Cutaways that worked as standalone clips were disproportionately rewarded in the attention economy of early internet video sharing, regardless of whether they served the episodes they came from. The show responded consciously or not to this incentive structure by producing cutaways that were increasingly designed to work as self-contained video clips rather than as integrated elements of a larger narrative. The cutaways became more elaborate, more standalone, more distinctly comic in isolation. They also became less connected to the stories around them because the stories around them were increasingly irrelevant to how the best of the material was actually being consumed. The Conway-Twitty phenomenon is the extreme version of this logic. A Conway-Twitty performance is the most self-contained possible form of cutaway. There is no gag, no joke, no comic content beyond the performance itself. It is literally just a piece of external entertainment material inserted into the episode with no connection to anything around it. As a standalone clip, it is interesting precisely because it is so absolutely nothing, so perfectly blank in its comedy ambition. As part of an episode, it is an abdication of the creative responsibility that the format assumes. The cutaway gag will remain part of Family Guy for as long as the show exists, because it is too fundamental to the show's identity to be removed without making it into something that audiences would not recognize as Family Guy. But understanding it as a technique, with specific requirements and specific failure modes, makes it possible to watch the show with a more precise sense of what is working and what is not, to be a more informed and more discerning member of the show's audience. Final thoughts. The long tail of something genuinely good. There is a quality that all the best long-running cultural phenomena share, regardless of whether their later years match their earlier ones. It is the quality of having done something well enough, early enough, that the accomplishment does not disappear even when it is no longer being replicated. The early seasons of Family Guy did something well enough that the cultural memory of it has not faded even after decades of uneven and sometimes genuinely disappointing subsequent seasons. The characters that MacFarlane and his original writing team created in those first 3 seasons were vivid enough and specific enough to survive everything that has been done to them since. Peter Griffin, however different he has become, is still instantly recognizable as Peter Griffin, still legible as a descendant of that first, warmer version of himself, however far the trajectory has carried him from that origin. The same is true of Brian, of Stewie, of Meg, of all the characters who populated 31 Spooner Street in 1999 and who still populate it today. The Iceberg is made of all of this, the achievements and the failures, the brilliant early work and the uneven later work, the production history and the creative decisions, and the real-world events that shaped the show in ways that nobody planned. It is a genuine history, long enough and rich enough that sitting with it offers real rewards for anyone willing to go deep enough. The show that airs on Wednesday nights in 2026 is not the show that aired after the Super Bowl in 1999, but it is connected to that show in ways that matter. The voice is the same voice, the characters have the same names, the house is still yellow and still at 31 Spooner Street. And somewhere underneath all the accumulated complexity of 27 seasons of production, the original vision is still present, diminished, altered, partially obscured, but recognizable to anyone who knows how to look for it. That is the deepest thing in the iceberg, not any specific fact or story, but the persistence of something genuinely good underneath everything that came after it. The water is still tonight. The house on Spooner Street is quiet. Somewhere, Brian is sitting at his typewriter, trying to find the right word. And the iceberg waits, patient and enormous and full of everything that ever happened to this show and everyone who made it. Sleep well. Script complete. Additional layer. The streaming era and what it changed. The relationship between Family Guy and the streaming era is one of the more underexplored aspects of the show's recent history, because streaming has changed not just how the show is distributed, but how it is consumed, discovered, and understood by new audiences who are encountering it for the first time. When Netflix first acquired streaming rights to Family Guy, and when the show subsequently moved its primary streaming home to Hulu, where new episodes are available the day after they air on Fox, the show's entire back catalog became simultaneously accessible to anyone with a subscription. This is a qualitatively different situation from the DVD era, when accessing old episodes required physical ownership, and from the cable rerun era, when accessing them required happening to be watching the right channel at the right time. The simultaneous availability of all 27 seasons means that new viewers can discover the show in any order, starting anywhere in the catalog, encountering the seasons in whatever sequence their algorithm or their curiosity takes them. A teenager discovering Family Guy in 2025 might start with a recent episode and work backward, or might start with a Season 6 episode that appeared in a clip online, or might be recommended the Season 8 Brian and Stewie episode as the show's best single episode and encounter the show first through its most atypical piece of work. This non-linear discovery process creates a different relationship with the show's history than the linear one that original viewers had. Someone who discovered the show through an algorithm recommendation does not have the experience of watching it grow and change over time. They encounter it as a completed object, or at least as a very large completed portion of an ongoing object, and their assessment of it is shaped by whichever portion they encounter first. This has specific consequences for how the show's decline is understood by audiences who come to it without the original context. For someone who discovers Family Guy through a later season episode and finds it satisfying, the critical consensus about the show's decline is not corroborated by their own experience. For someone who encounters the early seasons first and is then exposed to the later ones, the decline becomes viscerally apparent in ways that no critical description can fully substitute for. The streaming era has also made it easier for dedicated fans to make specific comparative arguments about the show's quality across seasons, to clip and share and juxtapose moments from different periods of the show's history in ways that support whatever argument they are making. The iceberg is built partly from this comparative activity, from the sustained critical engagement that streaming access has enabled. Hulu's relationship with Family Guy is interesting in its own right, because Hulu is partially owned by Disney, the company that also, through its acquisition of 21st Century Fox, owns Family Guy's production assets. The streaming home and the production rights are connected through the same corporate parent, which means that Family Guy's streaming presence is part of a larger corporate strategy about how animated content is distributed within the Disney ecosystem. This is a very different situation from the show's early years, when it was simply a Fox show airing on Fox and being watched by whoever happened to be in front of a television at the right time on Sunday nights. The corporate context shapes the show in ways that are not always visible but are always present. What Family Guy is allowed to do, what it is encouraged to do, and what it is constrained from doing are all shaped by its place within a much larger corporate entertainment ecosystem. An ecosystem with its own values, its own priorities, and its own assessments of what constitutes appropriate content for a global audience. The show that exists within that ecosystem is not identical to the show that would exist outside it, and the differences, while difficult to isolate, are real. Additional layer: the show's relationship with sports and American pop culture. Family Guy has always been deeply embedded in American popular culture, not just referencing it from outside, but functioning as an active participant in the ongoing conversation that American television, sports, music, and celebrity culture constitute collectively. The show's relationship with sports in particular is worth examining, because it reflects something specific about the world that the show was always trying to depict. Peter Griffin is a sports fan in the specific and deeply felt way that working-class New England men tend to be sports fans, not casually, not as an intellectual exercise, but as a form of identity and community and emotional investment that runs deeper than the games themselves. The Boston sports teams, the Red Sox, the Patriots, the Celtics, the Bruins are part of Peter's emotional landscape in ways that the show has explored throughout its run. These teams are not just things Peter watches. They are part of how he understands himself in relation to the world around him. This gives the show a specific regional texture that is sometimes lost in discussions that treat Family Guy as a generic American animated sitcom. The show is set in Rhode Island, adjacent to Boston, in a culture that is specific and historically rich and not simply a generic American suburbia. The accents, the sports loyalties, the particular ways that the characters relate to each other and to their community, all of these are specific to a real place in a way that The Simpsons Springfield, which was deliberately designed to be everywhere and nowhere, is not. The show's engagement with celebrity culture is another dimension of its relationship with American pop culture that has its own complicated history. Family Guy has always treated celebrities as a category of material, as people whose public personas provide raw material for comedy, whose recognizable characteristics can be deployed for comic effect in ways that more private citizens' characteristics cannot be. This is a well-established tradition in comedy and in satire, and the show has operated within it throughout its run. The specific way the show has used celebrities has changed over time. In the early seasons, celebrity references tended to be sharp and specific, aimed at particular qualities of particular public figures, grounded in actual knowledge of what those figures had said and done. In the later seasons, celebrity material became more generic. The references became more likely to be to celebrity as a category than to any specific celebrity's specific qualities, and the comedy became correspondingly thinner. This trajectory mirrors the broader shift in how the show approached all of its material, from the specific toward the generic, from the grounded toward the free-floating, from jokes that required knowledge and context to jokes that required only recognition of a name. It is part of the same pattern that affected the cutaway gags and the character writing and the show's relationship with its own history. A final word. Why icebergs matter. We have reached the bottom of tonight's descent. The water around you is very still and very dark, and the surface is a long way up. Looking back at the distance we have covered from the Super Bowl premiere in January of 1999 to the announced Stewie spinoff for 2027, from the security guard whose voice became Peter Griffin, to the conspiracy theories that proliferate around the show's most famous near-tragedy, the iceberg is a genuine and genuinely impressive thing. The reason icebergs matter is not the information they contain. Information is everywhere, and the specific facts about Family Guy's production history can be found in various forms across various sources. What an iceberg experience provides is something different. The accumulated weight of all that information held together in one continuous exploration, the sense of descent through layers of significance, the way that deep familiarity with something changes your relationship with it. When you know that Peter Griffin's voice came from a real security guard at a real school, you hear Peter differently. When you know that Stewie's British accent is, within the fiction of the show, an entirely fabricated persona, you watch Stewie differently. When you know that Seth MacFarlane arrived at Logan International Airport 10 minutes after a gate closed on a morning in September 2001, you understand the entire subsequent history of the show differently, as contingent, as lucky, as something that rested on the narrowest possible margin between existing and not existing. The iceberg does not change the show. The show is what it is, in all its seasons, with all its qualities and all its failures. But the iceberg changes how you hold the show, what you bring to the experience of watching it, what you are able to see in it, what you are able to appreciate about it that was always there but was not visible from the surface. That is why we go deep. That is why this kind of patient, unhurried exploration has value beyond the specific information it delivers. The descent teaches you how to see. The house on Spooner Street will be there when you open your eyes tomorrow. Brian will be at his typewriter. Stewie will be in his crib, making plans that nobody around him can understand. Peter will be in his chair, facing the television, half asleep. And underneath all of it, the iceberg will be where it has always been, waiting,